Yeah, that means a lot to me for us to have this event and us making it successful on this level. So he's one of the final parts and pieces. I've had a little insight lately having a phone call with him about what he's going to be talking about here. And I think it's really important to understand the level that he's working on and the different farms that he works with. And a lot of what we're doing isn't shown on social media. A lot of what and this isn't just for Jeremy, just in general with a lot of the companies that are here, because people are, functioning on a maybe tunnel vision for their success. They don't have time for those things. They don't need those things. It's just they're chugging along at such a level. So you don't get to see a lot of the stuff that we really do and the customers we help out on a daily basis, the hours we spend on the phone. There's definitely a huge synergy in between BuildASoil and Grassroots. And one thing we always knew in the beginning is, anybody can call BuildASoil, and they've got a team of people that can answer your questions and are going to be on the phone with you and help you out, and even specifically for their products. There's so many times I've called and been like, how am I going to, use this silica, or how am I going to do this? So, thank you, Jeremy, for what you do for our industry. And again, thank you for speaking at this summit. And yes, this is the first time you doing this kind of thing, but I have a lot of confidence in you just absolutely killing it. So I appreciate you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So let's get this started. I've been waiting. Like he mentioned, this is new to me. I've never done something like this. I've done some speaking. But for all of us getting up here, I'm sure they felt the same way, that these are our peers. Like, these are who we want to hang out with. You guys are all the people that I really enjoy discussing these topics with. And so one of the first things that I want to get out is that the BuildASoil way that I'll be discussing, it's not something that we created. This is just something that I've been blessed to be able to share with others at the tip of the spear as someone who's passionate about the same things you are. And so when we learn this, oftentimes with social media, we're sharing it. But previous to that, we were all on the forums, and a lot of us were very scared to share this information or talk to anybody in our sphere of influence about it. And so those relationships were crystallized in a time where we didn't have a lot of people to talk about, and it just felt so relieving to be able to get that info or hear what someone else had done. And so it's in that spirit that when BuildASoil started, we made sure that we were very transparent. We shared everything that we were doing, especially because I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy who likes to do this stuff, and when I see good results, it makes me happy. And I've also tinkered. Most of us, when we first started, we were told a lot of the same things. And if we're trying to grow cannabis, I know I was told, it didn't work. You're not going to have success. Or we tried, couldn't figure it out. And then beyond that, the hydroponic nutrients, the pH, all of the different things that many of us had to go through. Until we realized, you mean you could just grow this like a tomato plant? Like literally in soil without any of that stuff? And it seems silly now, but that's important. And so I'm going to go on a little journey, and I'm going to go fast through some of the boring stuff, hopefully, because I want to bring up a few key points. But first, the BuildASoil way. I mentioned to you that's just a amalgamation. It's like a whole bunch of different topics over the last 15 years. Each time we'd find a better way. Each time there would be congruence within the industry. Hey, this is working. Are you seeing the same thing? We started to add on to that. And so at the very end, I have the 21 fundamental BuildASoil principles. Those are a little bit more geared towards indoor growing, but a lot of this applies to vegetables. We have a vegetable farm. So, what to expect? We're going to cover the last 170 years of agriculture, not in very much detail at all. I'm going to cherry pick a few points in history that may have shifted the trajectory about organic farming, chemical farming, where the funding is coming from, things like this. The realization that there's no singular right way. I've noticed something amongst all of us. The different factions and crowds, even with organics, they all produce results. The hydroponics, I've grown that way. It produces results. It's not my thing anymore, but I feel like a lot of the BuildASoil way is taking what works and leaving what doesn't, and it doesn't necessarily matter where that came from. We'll discuss those things. Similarities in gut health and soil health and the feeding of this life, and there's a lot of similarities there. It's very hard not to discuss it when we get into the life in the soil and how plants live. Highlighting plants can eat and can be heterotrophic. And I'm really going to drive this point home because it's fascinating to me, and it may not seem like much, but I was taught that plants only absorb water-soluble ions, and that organics is a very long way to get to the same water-soluble ions. And so, to me, finding out that there's actual documentation that shows that plants eat and drink larger ions and bacteria, that's everything to me, because now it means that some of these methods we use that they say don't work, like the foliar feeding or the top dressing and the larger protein molecules versus amino acids, if that's possible, then feeding and caring for that life becomes very important, and that's why we see such dramatic plant health differences from people that aren't very experienced at growing. They no longer have to be fully in control. There's something that they can trust that can bring balance despite there being some imbalance. And we'll discuss some of those key approaches, bringing it all back together into the methods that we call the BuildASoil way and how to potentially implement this process your way. Most of what we deal with at BuildASoil are fundamentals. And so I'm not trying to teach someone that there's only one way to do this organic process. I'm trying to share the fundamental principles that would make it so that you can implement this in any situation. For instance, the home grower with a 4x4 tent can go pretty hard on every desire they have in the organic field. But in a commercial setting, some of them might mess with your standard operating procedures. Some of them might cause conflict for some of the testing as far as biology, or might be scary when you have money on the line. And so I encourage each type of person, whether they're commercial, backyard, indoor, to remember that. They don't have to do everything that we're discussing, but we're trying to find a way to, for most of our home grower customers, live a busy lifestyle and still tap into this and have very healthy plants. And it's really that simple. There's so much you could talk about from commercial level and going deep down every rabbit hole, but I just want our customers that want good herb and good food to be able to get results without having to understand every single detail. And so that's a lot of what this is about. First off, can you guys hear me okay? I feel like when I get about here, it's a little quiet. What about now? Is that, yeah? Okay. Okay, so the BuildASoil way. My background, for those of you that don't know, my name is Jeremy Silva. I founded BuildASoil from my garage in Montrose, Colorado on the western slopes in 2012. It was really like the very end. So basically 2013. We got our first couple of sales in the end of 2013 and really started to run with it in 2014. And prior to that, I was going to grow tomatoes and call it Montrose tomato. And I was going to utilize the living soil methodology. And up until that point, I thought if you had to sell tomatoes, you had to grow them hydroponically. Like, how could you grow them the same way, right? And then, of course, you see the greenhouses across the way here. And that's very similar to the process that we use on our vegetable farm. And seeing that was more confirmation in these methods that you can produce that level utilizing these same principles that we were doing indoors. So besides that, the BuildASoil Family Farms was founded in 2018. Gwen Silva is my wife, and she runs all of the farming. And so I'm able to, like I said, further entrust in these systems by seeing them not only operate indoors, but seeing them operate for a market garden for restaurants and for local consumers and that production level without using any chemicals, any synthetics, any pesticides, herbicides. And so that just raises the confidence level up that this is absolutely a viable method. We also saw a huge boom and collapse in the hemp industry, and that led to a lot of data collection. I feel like in particular where we were, I got to see a lot more soil tests, try a lot more organic practices, and that a lot of those lessons stuck with me, and we were able to share many of those with our other customers. But beyond that, we do manufacture potting soil. And so throughout that process, we test at the lab every single input that comes in, and we test all the batches that go out, and we've had to change formulas. And so that's given me some insight into how much the testing matters and how little it does, depending on the situation. And I think that provides some unique insight. Disclaimer, I'm just a guy who loves to grow plants and to build soil. I'm not an expert. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a regular guy. So if I can do this, any one of you can. And the only reason I say that is because we have a big following on YouTube. And I don't want to get to the point where I can't say something because somebody goes and tries it and thinks that I'm like some scientist. We're just having a blast with this stuff. And I hope that you take the information and run with it. But again, this is just a grouping of information from all of us together, and I think you'll agree with a lot of it. And then lastly, it's information from over a decade of hands-on experience and thousands of conversations on the phone with our customers as well. That's helped push the learning for me. And then because we can't know it all, even through all these conversations, all the different soil testing, one of the things that I'll be discussing today is that through mimicking nature, we can start to find a little bit more trust. And what I mean by that is that nature, there's the 100-year flood, right? We always prepare for something, and it ends up being worse than it could have been. There's tricks that nature has, and the reason why I say that is when we're looking to create a system, sometimes it's not obvious why having multiple different ways of doing the same thing would be important. Redundancies built in, different ways to take up nutrients, different ways to care for plants. And I feel like nature's got this down. And so it may look like, oh, waste of energy to do something until you have that drought that year, or until you have some infection come in your room, and as a living soil grower, you only have a small problem, not your entire crop gone. And that is a more robust system. It's what they call antifragile. And I'll be discussing one of my favorite books called Antifragile. And the author created the term because there wasn't a word for it. There's fragility and there's strength, but the opposite of fragility is actually getting stronger through a chaotic event. What I mean, like a forest fire, nature finds a way to be even more resilient after that, not be taken down by that. And it takes an entire book just to describe the term and go into what that means, and it gives you a really good reference for thinking. But I love it, so I'll mention that a couple of times. And obviously, when you mimic nature, that's going to lead to more biology, not sterility. Everywhere we look, the more we look, there's biology literally everywhere, and we're going to get down into that, even in the head of the trichome. And to me, that is absolutely fascinating. Mulch, worms, all the other stuff, we're going to talk about some of those things because that's really a big part of the process. I mentioned antifragile. It's a term coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb in the book Antifragile, things that gain from disorder. And living soil systems, a lot of us are attracted to them because of that resilience, the independence we can create. Hydrostore can close, I'm still going to grow. Doesn't matter. I don't need a part A, part B, right? You can see them making compost, doing everything outside. This concept describes systems that actually benefit and grow stronger from shocks, volatility, and stressors, in contrast to being merely resilient or robust. Okay? Taleb's idea focuses on how certain systems, organizations, or individuals can thrive and improve, whether exposed to unpredictable events, randomness, and uncertainty. Listen to the book. It's kind of long and boring, I think, to read, but listening to it on a drive, it's really fascinating. Some of the points, check it out if you get a chance. But the key point is, can thrive or improve when exposed to unpredictable events. One of the things I learned in hydro was something unpredictable can take your entire grow down. You're at work, all of a sudden there's a flood, and bam, they're dead. And I really, having a busy lifestyle, I like that it's more anti-fragile. So the problem, it's not necessarily an us versus them, but a lot of times it feels like it, especially when you're talking to a lot of my friends that would say, hey, what's the problem? Why do you eat organic? You know, the banana peel's got a thick skin on it. The pesticide's not going to go through. I've heard so many things where it just feels like we're kind of taught to think that GMOs are good and pesticides aren't that bad. I know none of us in here really think that way, but it's so ubiquitous. Based on mineral theory is something that I really want to discuss today. We'll get a little deeper. But based on the mineral theory that plants can only take up water-soluble ions. That's really one of the key components that I found to be different when I started growing in living soil. I'm like, there's something else going on here because I'll get into it, okay? Declining soil health, right? Food lacking nutrition, importing food from all over the world at a high cost. I'd love it if we could grow our own. It doesn't take that much space, even container gardening, to grow small amounts of fresh food. Pesticides, herbicides, poisoning our children. I mean, we could talk about this. I think a lot of us are in agreement. Big chemical ag. The world previously fed by over 7,000 crops. I was fascinated when I started growing. I think you guys probably feel the same way, but how many people like looking through the seed catalogs for the vegetable companies? And when you're a kid, it's like, there's this many tomatoes? Like, holy shit, there's every color I can think of. I didn't really know that, and I just was raised in a cul-de-sac, and I think that's part of why I'm so fascinated. Like, I'm so intrigued with all of this. The need for food security favored the intensive production of a few crops, right? So now we have like 4 crops that basically produce over half the world's food, and that seems fragile to me, right? That's not anti-fragile. Now we have to feed the animals, fuel the vehicles, and feed the whole population off 4 crops. And certainly I feel like a lot of us felt that during Corona when the grocery stores were empty. And I was very, at that time, going, well, thank God we have a vegetable farm, right? I mean, so it's really a reality. GMO soil organisms. I added this in here because as if the Roundup Ready wasn't bad enough, a lot of the conversations I have from someone who's curious, right? They're like, so why is GMO bad? And they will genuinely be curious, and I'll explain that most of the GMOs that are done are not to create something that's going to save the world. It's to cover them in pesticides and use herbicides. And then there's a huge problem from that, and people are hearing that their kids' blood might actually have these chemicals in there from the cereal they're eating, and they're just like, what's going on? What is happening? But they're making soil organisms now to go along with the seed. And to me, that's just fucking crazy. They can go put it in the soil without asking anybody. There's no regulation on it. There's no monitoring, and they're altering the biology and sending it out. Now, I have a faith that our biology, the natural biology, can shred that shit up and really return back to normal. But it doesn't seem like a good idea to put like Frankenstein microbes out there when anyways. The effects could be devastating, okay? And at the end of it, that still means that big ag recognizes the value in microbes. They can't get away from it as much as they would like to. You'll see there's a ton of bio-agricultural type of companies, and most of them are leading back up to the big few that we want to avoid, to controlling even the microbiological world instead of just leaving it with the GMO crops and the pesticides. And it's important. So human health versus soil health. We've seen a decline in health in the United States, and this is where I start to relate it to food a little bit. I've always jokingly compared BuildASoil to like a chef running a kitchen, and how I don't want to, run Campbell's soup and serve that as if I made it. I'd rather start from scratch. Some of the original soil recipes that we learned about would start with a bagged potting soil, and I thought, well, how do they make that? That would be starting from scratch. Some of that initial desire is where BuildASoil came from as well. But I believe a lot of this is due to eating processed foods, some of the health issues, not necessarily just the chemical-laden foods besides all the processing, right? Science has created seed oils, fake sugars, fake butters. I was told it was better growing up, right? We all know now, like, it's 100% not true. Those things will kill you. Similar to a doctor prescribing pill after pill for symptoms and side effects, the big chemical ag complex would prefer new miracle products for each symptom. And when you see a holistic farm like this, and you start to do some of that on your own property, you really realize a lot of the problems are a problem of scale and are a problem of monocropping. And so it's kind of like we're fixing our own problems, and there has to be a better way. Just like human health is all about the gut and our food, the same is with agriculture. The soil and the food which feeds the soil contained within, and this is what I want to talk about. For a while when I was growing up, I was like, oh, so the gut health is important. You just take a little pill that fixes your gut health? It's probiotic. While probiotics have their place, and there's a big difference, I know, and we'll have a conversation about adding microbials and all of that, but I think focusing on what you eat is more important than trying to add the biology, specifically and living off that, right? We need to return to the source. So there aren't shortcuts. We must return to husbandry. Why grow in living soil? Anybody can do it. Of course, anybody can grow hydro and all these other things, but when I give someone an Earthbox and a seed and teach them environment, they crush. They do a really good job. And a big part of that is because the Earthbox takes care of the watering. And the watering is one of the biggest learning curves when you're just starting this. We'll talk about that. Soil health equates to human health. Living soil supports healthy plants for generations to come, and that's very important. I don't disagree water-soluble ions work. You can grow plants with them. There's times where I use water-soluble organics. But when we're ruining our soil to do that, I feel like we're not thinking about generations to come in the future. There's no need for the GMOs, and living soil is more anti-fragile. Nature knows best. We want to avoid the black swan, the one bad event, right? And I've already mentioned in hydro, I was scared. There is one event that could wipe down your whole grow. Even something as, when you're brand new and you get spider mites and you just didn't know what you didn't know and it was too late. When you see that shit in hydro and it was too long and it's like webbed out versus a soil grow where you might have noticed some at the end of harvest, it's dramatic difference in the fragility of those systems. Plants do more than absorb ions. I'm repeating this because against so much of what we were taught in schools, I really believe this to be true. And so a little bit of the history that I'm going to go over. I'm going to go through some history that I'm not really an expert on. I'm going to highlight some key points and kind of skip through some of it. And I'll get to the part where we've put a lot of testing into the super soils and the TLO and kind of what led us up to living organic soil in a raised bed, if that makes sense. So the mineral theory is taught and even adapted to organics. And I believe this makes it hard for farmers to understand why they would want to grow organically when organic just gets the same mineral ions at the end of it. And now they're thinking, well, I have to understand how to do the same thing I'm doing in chemical farming, but now I have to do it through this convoluted organic process? That sounds hard. I don't want to do it. And so I try not to refer to, oh, in organics, we just get the nutrients exactly where they need to be, because that's the same thing that they're doing. And there is more to it, especially for the backyard farmer. Plants can eat, they can drink, and they can do this besides just absorbing water-soluble ions, and we're going to get into that. And plants are more than just autotrophs. And so I was always taught that they're autotrophic, they photosynthesize, they have to create their nutrients, and then they absorb them as ions. They're not like us, they don't just eat food. But there's some new information coming out that says that maybe that's not correct. So how did we get here? I was taught in school about the Dust Bowl. And so we realized, man, maybe this constant tilling and all of our topsoil is blowing away. Maybe there's a better way. There was some research money going on at that time to solve a lot of these problems. And the late 1930s and 40s, a lot of advancements in this soil science and cation exchange science. Albrecht. In World War II, food producers were really needed. So World War II changed a lot of that. We had nitrogen being made for bombs. As part of the war machine, farmers were subsidized now. So they're being subsidized to overproduce every inch of their land and grow in this new methodology and use all of the fertilizers. At this time, the Industrial Revolution was also taking over. So it's like, let's industrialize all of this and let's just crank it as hard as we can. They also took over the land-grant universities. And I think this is one of the bigger differences. Now you see all the education pushed into the chemical-based agriculture. And there was some voices at the time that were highlighting scientific studies saying there's other ways plants eat, there's other things going on here, and I feel like we're now just coming back to that. There's now research being put into it, and there's new information coming out, which hasn't changed our practices. Like, many of us won't farm differently because of a new biological finding. We'll just have a deeper understanding of why what we've always done really does work, and that's pretty cool too. So yields went up, right? Of course, you have soil, you put some fertilizer on it, you're going to see it. And we started stealing from the soil, so to speak, and the decline began. Last 170 years, there's a lot of text up here. I tried to make it not walls of text and not terribly boring. I promise I'm just going to skip through and get on some key points. And then as we get closer to the end, I have the final 21 principles that could open up some good conversations, and I'd like to take questions as well, if anybody has any, so maybe be thinking about that as we go. 1830 to 1870, Oliver Sheffield, and this is before Darwin. These are big names. A lot of us know von Liebig, right, the nitrogen process. Oliver was using earthworm husbandry to reduce his farm from 3,000 acres to 250 acres with better yields. And you're like, well, I wasn't taught about any of that. Charles Darwin, I never heard about him working with worms. I wasn't taught about that in school. Darwin started investigating how the activity of worms contributes to the structure of field soil. In 1881, published the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms. And by that time, Liebig had basically already won over. So a lot of this information was starting to fade. And the manufacturing of the nitrogen process, the mineral theory, they started burning plants to determine what minerals were in them so they could prescribe to the soil what would be needed to grow them. 1840, Justus von Liebig burned plants, expanded the methods of chemical analysis. They said, well, if we burn it and it's in there, it must need that to grow. That's what we'll provide. Just because there's an end and a beginning doesn't mean that that's all that's part of the process, right? I think we can see that. And kind of a joke, his name literally is Liebig. I know that's not how you pronounce it. It's kind of funny. It's kind of crazy. His name's Liebig, and we trusted him forever. 1848, Pasteur, so active same time as Liebig, discovered anthrax and chicken cholera pathogens, okay? Why is this important? Why does that matter? Well, he developed vaccines, and around this time, it triggered an excessive hunt for basically anything bacterial, and let's kill it. It's all bad. 99.9% is what you want to kill. They're probably trying to get us. And I feel like we're finally just coming out of that. Of course, Corona didn't really help, but I feel like many of us were trusting the soil microbes more than the hand sanitizer. And there's something to be said about that. And we'll get into it a little bit. 1872. So this guy wrote about Albrecht Daniel Thayer, okay? He assumed that plant food was made up of organic, compostable, arising from living beings, animals, and plants, material found in the soil. And the more of it contained in the field in a proper state, the more fertile the land was. 1875, 1883, published Microzymus, developing the idea that micrococci, which he called microzymus, were present in all living organs and played a significant role in animal and plant tissues. And the guys, they're probably calling him crazy, right? He's like, no, there's little things in here. Like, they're present in everything. He believed these symbiotic germs at the time possessed a strong adaptive ability, and they could be living beyond the lifespan of their host, meaning there's some sort of teaming up from coming in evolution from the ocean or whatever happened where microbes potentially combine together and break down into their individual components, not necessarily die, depending on the situation. But then, 1876, Justin von Liebig, Organic Chemistry and its Applications to Agriculture and Physiology, it said that the old doctrine assumed that food eaten by plants of organic nature, and that the new doctrine, on the other hand, supposed that food eaten by green plants was of an inorganic nature, and that minerals were converted within the body of the plant to perform organic functions, thus creating mineral theory. The food eaten by all green plants consists of inorganic mineral substances, and this is what we were taught since then. And so you're always told, like, why is organics better? Who cares? All these microbes have to make the same salts that I'm going to use. And a lot of us are like, man, I'm going to go look up how to argue with that. It's bullshit. And there is definitely more to it, and we're going to get into that. Okay. Let me see. Did I go? All right. So 1876. Oh, I already went that. Okay. Louis Pasteur proved the interior of plants are sterile. We know this not to be true. We're going to talk about literally bacteria inside the trichome head. But at this time, he's basically saying pasteurization, right? Invented the pasteurization process. He says the interior of plants are sterile. And this is the belief, okay? So of course it has to be water-soluble ions if the inside of the plant is sterile. But evidence to the contrary exists as well. And there's some of these are like fun places to research. There's some rad books that are open source at this point. You can download and see kind of some of this history. 1898, Julius Hensel, Bread from Stones. We've talked about this book. Many of you have probably downloaded it on the forum days when we were talking about remineralizing, remineralize.org, using basalt, using glacial rock dust. Why? Because of the volcanoes and how they remineralize and the glacial movement. Bread from Stones was often discussed as a book, and they used granite, I believe, probably because of the East Coast. But in there, he thought that NPK might actually be a toxin in the soil. It's like a byproduct of the end. So not everybody's right all the time, but it's interesting to hear the different thoughts and what was going on at the time. The German chemist was a little out there, but was really onto something. And the chemical companies at the time launched a really big campaign to denigrate him and say it's basically all bullshit. But I think all of us in here probably use rock dust. And so it's interesting how this kind of comes back around. And I learned that as a kid. A lot of people make new discoveries, and they're kind of ridiculed for it. 1911, this guy Rao published Das Edaphan, first scientific summary and definition of the flora and fauna in the soil, 1911. He later published The Life in Soil. And so here I am thinking, okay, this whole biological movement's pretty new. You know, they're learning about the microbes, and in the beginning of the 1900s, they were already documenting a lot of this. 1913, Fritz Haber, Karl Bosch. A lot of people hear their last names due to the nitrogen process. Starting in 1913, making ammonia for bomb production during World War I. In 1920, the first ammonia-based fertilizer was manufactured. So 1920 is when they first started that. Rudolf Steiner, 8 lectures of the spiritual foundations for the renewal of agriculture, coming in between these times. And why that's important, I mentioned it, most of us know what biodynamic farming is. We've heard of it, we've looked into it. We'll discuss a lot of the processes or a lot of the subsects of organic coming up here soon. But these lectures were designed to counteract the decline of fertility in soils they were already aware of, okay? And spiritual and energy-based systems that conceptualize agriculture and natural sciences. And so they basically begged him to give these lectures. And he wanted to try and make a change because there was decline happening, and brought a lot of spiritual energy into it, started talking about other things versus just this fertilization theory. 1933, this guy, Arturi, published experimental results that refuted the idea that plants feed on pure nitrogen, which had prevailed since Liebig. Through these decisive experiments, we've been able to prove that non-legumes, so we're always talking about how the legumes fix nitrogen, and he's saying the non-legumes can make exceptionally effective use of the organic nitrogen compounds that issue forth from the root nodules of legumes. It's clear that non-legumes, when growing together with legumes in nature or under cultivation, actually use these compounds directly without first having to be broken down through the formation of ammonia and nitrates. And it's fascinating because the whole nitrogen cycle is a big deal. They say that in virgin native soil, there aren't these soluble salt ions there, and plants have to be eating in a different way. We discussed polycultures. Of course, I'm not growing cover crop in my indoor container thinking I'm growing nitrogen-fixing nodules and feeding my cannabis plant directly. But the possibility of it getting nitrogen through many of these interactions is much greater than I was taught. I was taught, like, no, there's no way they're going to get any of that. And anyways, we'll get there, I promise. So that was the first time that he started saying, no, there's a way they're using this without going through the ammonium and nitrate cycle. And so that's kind of a key point. 1940, Albert Howard, British botanist, mycologist, pioneer of eco-agriculture. He described mycorrhizae symbiosis. So 1940, mycorrhizae. We all use mycorrhizae. So many conversations when we first learned, like, wait, the fungus and the root, and it helps get nutrients. This was in 1940. He described it in which plant roots are able to absorb carbohydrates and proteins. The fungal root thus forms a living bridge between plant and soil. And when you start to study the first plants, you realize, man, they couldn't get nutrients on their own coming from the ocean, how that happened. And so they had to start to team up with biology. I almost picture us as kind of an end product of billions of bacteria that wanted to walk around, right? And so we have DNA and a ton of biology in here. And so they're teaming up. And 1947, Hugo Schandorl published a new basis for botanical bacteriology and plant nitrogen balance. So he says modern bacteriology is still firmly rooted in the monomorphism in the previous century. It still hasn't begun to think evolutionarily, not linearly. And so over the course of evolutionary history, primordial cells came together into large cooperative units. The constituent members of the larger cells lost their independence in the union and were assigned special roles in new larger cells, eventually becoming functional organics and organelles. If some outside influence disturbs or destroys this organization, the constituent units once again take on independent lives and return to the previous low level of organization. It's a long, boring paragraph, but what is so crazy about this is thinking that inside one organism we're looking at in a microscope, you're thinking that's one organism, but its internal chloroplast, the internal parts of it could actually be separate living entities teaming up to form one organism, and when broken down can do individual jobs again, and then maybe team back up again. When I first started using EM1, Eric Lancaster from Terraganics, he's like, you don't need all that. These will build all of those. And I'm like, how? They're different. But there's definitely something about like a transformer capability that many microbes have in teaming up together. And that's fascinating. And I think that's part of why we may not need to be so specific about exactly which biology comes from which location in every understanding of it when the plants are growing really healthy. Sometimes it's just better left to that. 1950, Annie France Harrar published The Last Chance of a Future Without Hardship. It's probably the only summary of the scientific history of the worldwide humus catastrophe. France Harrar's central theme is the ongoing decline in humus content caused by 10,000 years of human agriculture activity is responsible for entire cultures dying out, people's migrations, colonialism, and world trade. Her writing suggests that decentralization represents the only hope. What she means by that is, like, we've gone through this. We all need to grow our own food, right? Every time it's completely mechanized, all of the types of agricultural farming, it's been a problem for many civilizations and many cultures. We're getting closer. I swear there's a lot here. 1950, mineral fertilizers come to dominate the globe right after World War II. 50 to 80, the so-called Green Revolution, okay? The Green Revolution was an all-out chemical war on non-industrial ag. Add to this genetic modification, and the beginning of the ongoing contamination of our biosphere started to get out of control. And there was awakening happening. 1955, Hans Peter Rush published a collection of lectures called The Nature Sciences of Tomorrow, lectures on conservation at the cycle of living material. It was an attempt to establish the principles of living material as the foundation of biology, and he published a study of biological thinking. It's a very interesting read. At the beginning of this century, scientists were in agreement, with few exceptions, that this formulation was accurate, okay? Any organic material must be mineralized in the soil before plants can absorb it. The view was that no organism, not even animals or humans, was capable of absorbing large organic molecules into its body. Much has changed since then. Anyone who still thinks about a complete breakdown of all nutrient substances into mineral salts today has either slept through the entire eventful period or is pursuing particular economic aims that no longer bear any relation to science. And I'm just driving home this point that mineral nutrition, water-soluble, is not the only way. And we're going to talk about some of the other methods. 1958, Nicolai published a paper that suggested plants seem to feed not only on autotrophic, but heterotrophically as well. So they've talking about this in the 50s. I mean, we're just now, at the end, 2010, we're talking about Rhizophagy, and I can't wait to get there. But in the 50s, they were talking about this stuff. 62, Silent Spring. The book gives a description of the destructive consequences of the worldwide use of pesticides and herbicides. Around that time was basically the beginning of organic ag, what we call organic agriculture. So 1968, Hans Peter Rush, Soil Fertility, a study of biological thought advocating for the cycle of living materials as the basis of nutrition. 1970, endosymbiotic theory. Lynn believed that primordial bacteria were the first true life forms and that all other further forms developed from them. She was quoted as saying that animal and plant cells originated through symbiosis is no longer controversial. Molecular biology, including gene sequencing, has vindicated. So basically, she was proven right, that these primordial beginnings did team up, did work together, and that you can actually track that through some of the new gene sequencing that they're doing. And so she was actually ridiculed at the time. She kept to her thoughts, and she was proven right. 1978, Bill Mollison and David, everybody knows permaculture. So Permaculture 1, this is like the beginning, 1978. 1982, Capra writes about organelles and going on into symbiosis that take place within the cells of higher organisms. And it appears that some of the organelles and organisms in their own right, the mitochondria, for example, which are often called the powerhouses of the cell because they rule out almost all cellular energy systems, contain their own genetic material and can replicate independently of the replication of the cell. Just further driving home, like these are independent portions that have now been added together, okay? 1983, I was born. It's a huge part in the process. 1988, James Lovelock published The Ages of Gaia. Gaia is another big, anyways, if you haven't gone down any of those rabbit holes, The Ages of Gaia. 1989, explanation of plant endocytosis. We're going to talk about this. Peter Tompkins wrote about John Homaker and Rattiver and explained plant endocytosis. I want to get there. Endocytosis and rhizophagy. And then we're just going to get into the normal BuildASoil stuff. But that buildup is to share with you why I believe a lot of our methodologies work so well and why I saw such healthy plants when I started using cover crop, using biology, using compost teas, using top dressing. I think it's because I was feeding the plants in different ways, and I didn't have to be so chemically perfect about the balance of nutrients any longer. I had a partner in that, and the plant was able to do that. Further research into endocytosis, there was this Garden of Microbial Delights, and it talks about heterotrophic plant nutritions in 93. Heterotrophic is what we're talking about when we say other ways of feeding themselves. And then 1977, this guy, Smill, writes about these traditional ag methods. There's a few different books on it, about China and Egypt and other parts of the world that basically like have farmed for thousands of years without ruining everything and outproduced what we're capable of. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that. 1997, Louis Jackson on nitrogen demonstrates that mechanisms plants absorb nutrients has not by any means been fully explained. And so still today, they're learning new things. And to me, that gives me a little bit of mistrust in fully believing all the scientific revelations when 10 years later, we find out that that was wrong and something else is new, kind of like margarine. 1999, symbiotic planet. So all her life, the biologist demonstrated she basically had the courage to stick to what she was saying. And she has an endosymbiotic theory according to which all animals and plant cells at some point formed via the amalgamation of various types of bacteria, and it was met with heavy resistance. Basically, everything was formed from groupings of bacteria. And so the biology theory is, I think, very, very important. 2000, a lot of resurgence in organic gardening was happening. 2006, this life and work of Professor Ederlein served as a dissertation in medical history during World War I. She discovered that certain microbes and the overall condition of the body are actually responsible for our health. And then we had the whole Human Genome Project and the gut biome, and really like, wow, this is where some of our health comes from. We thought it was everywhere else in the body except for there. And then at the end here, like stem cells have proven that you can create building block cells that can change and morph and do different things. And so there's basically proof across the board of all of this. Endocytosis is what I was referring to as one of the methods. So we're going to get into two methods briefly. Like, I'm not a scientist. I just think it's fascinating. Endocytosis is one of the methods whereby a plant can literally eat, even without the benefit of the biology relating to the root, but rubbing up against it and taking in, say, a large protein molecule instead of just a water-soluble ion, and actually engulfing it, creating a pocket, and wrapping it, and taking it within its root system, and then utilizing its components. Like one bacteria, I believe, is 50% protein. There's other mechanisms for which they could farm these bacteria and utilize them to give them nutrients besides just the solid particles. So one of them is called phagocytosis, and it's where it eats. The pinocytosis is where it drinks. And then there's a lot of new study, which I'm not going to get into, on receptor-mediated endocytosis. And that's basically where you have special coatings that they're now trying to track how much of these different pathways plants utilize. So one of the things I want to just refresh is I talked about this antifragile component. Even within the newest stuff we're learning, nature still has multiple different ways that it does things, multiple different pathways that it can take advantage of these techniques. But just like human health, I feel like it may not be taking advantage of some of these if it doesn't have to. Like when a human, if you cut out all your carbs, you're going to switch over into ketosis. You start burning lots of fat. But we're not going to burn all that fat unless there's a reason to do that. And I believe organic systems always have ways. And that's part of why a lot of times we're like, man, don't feed the nutrients. You're going to shut off the mycorrhizal connection. That may not be entirely true, but nature doesn't waste energy. It's going to take that path of least resistance. 2010, that full lead up into some of the most fascinating science today. There's so much. I mean, this is a while ago, and now the cannabis community is learning about it. There's interviews, there's videos. If you have not seen James White video, there's like a million different versions of it, of him giving the same speech. You have to go watch it. If that's one thing you get out of today, it's just mind-blowing. And so what is rhizophagy? I talked about endocytosis, and that's where instead of just absorbing water-soluble ions, our plants can literally eat and drink. And we're talking, yes, it's small, but it's like 40 to 100 times bigger than we were thinking when you're talking about a protein molecule versus an amino acid. Like literally, it's taking cells in and eating them. Not like a Venus flytrap, but below in the root system. And so the similarity to that is that rhizophagy is a cycle of how plant gets nutrients. And I have a illustration. It's probably really hard to see. You should watch the video. But essentially, it's a long explanation about how important microbes are to this process. And in these zones, this is a root tip, there's zones where the biology enters inside the root, exits the root, enters the root, exits the root, and does jobs in the thin layer on the outside. Every single one of the root hairs will not be a root hair without biological interaction. They've sterilized the root tip. It's completely smooth. As soon as there's a biological interaction, bam, root hairs pop. And now they're starting to research more like, they're creating this ethylene, and that's creating this response. But at the end of the day, I want to get to the next part, but this is a whole biological process whereby now they can farm the microbes, have them do specific jobs around that root zone, whether that be going and getting nutrients and bringing that back in, whether that might be utilizing the microbe itself and stripping it down and terminating it to utilize its energy. This is all happening in the root system. And of course, it might be harder for these biological practices to happen if it's covered in sodium. So soil balancing still has merit. I don't think on an unhealthy farm you're going to find terrible soil. And if the goal is to get there, then soil testing makes a ton of sense from BuildASoil's perspective. We're mixing potting soil from scratch. I don't want terrible compost to go into it or have problems out the gate. But many of the biological processes that occur here like this, even without soil testing, if you give a farm 4 or 5 years and you give it lots of input into the biology like cover crop and rotations, you can still develop very, very healthy soil without having to do all of that. I just think there's quicker ways with all the technology we have. So root hairs equals bacteria present. So this is that picture you can see during that James White. It's fascinating. And it shows no microbes in the seedlings. They've been thoroughly disinfected, and this is what it looks like. And part of why I want to share this with you is that to get this response here, it took bacterium. There was literally no root hairs without bacterium. And of course, even in hydroponics, there's biology that's occurring in there, good and bad. The bacterium present, though, what's so neat, this is the Pseudomonas florensis. It was inoculated onto a disinfected root. Guess what? It popped off. So this is why a lot of times I'll have growers that it's like, I didn't think I was going to sell a microbial product. Rootwise has become one of our best-selling products. And if you overwater and the root hairs die, or if you have fresh soil that's really not ramped up to life, you've not grown any roots in it yet, or even when you're just inoculating, all of a sudden you can see a completely sterile seedling, and now there's completely different action just from outside inoculation. So as much as I'd like to think that, hey, we don't need any of these products, as a business owner, when I'm trying to help newer growers that are oftentimes breaking all the rules, they don't know how to water, the container is too small, they have issues that pop up, leveraging biology became a tool to make sure that we could widen that area for success. And so I'm a big believer that we don't really need anything. 90% of the stuff we sell, you just don't need. But we're hobbyists, we're enthusiasts, we love this stuff. We want to experience the differences that some of these products can make. And of course, when we're artificial, we're indoors. I don't have 30 feet of soil to tap into to go get nutrients by cycling crops. A quick soil test, some biology, and a lot of love, can make all the difference. So I'm not trying to say one method is right. I'm just trying to say that besides the mineral theory, that's day one. That's brand new soil, just balanced. That's the beginning. Just like when we're talking about GLP and the farm here, this started in the beginning with mineral testing, making sure there's no imbalances, and then building from this. That's a big part of the BuildASoil way. So trichome nitrogen. This is fairly new to me, okay? And I try not to talk about stuff that I don't know about or that I'm researching before I'm discussing. I try and only talk about stuff that is just my everyday life that I've learned about. But this is too much fun, and it's really part of the same subject that I've been leading up to that's, hey, organic growing in soil the BuildASoil way is not about just comparing available water-soluble nutrients on a paste test. That may be some indication, but I got to tell you, we're going to get there. We had some really shitty soil tests from all the different super soils and stuff we tested from our customers over the years that were still slaying it. And I'm like, dude, there's more to this. This doesn't make any sense. It says plants can't grow in these conditions. So the trichome nitrogen, why did I even mention nitrogen? Part of that conversation, you can go watch that YouTube video on Rhizophagy, is postulating. Now, this is not proven yet, but there's parts of it are proven. They're still wondering what they're witnessing. There's biology, there's bacteria, literally, this is the top of the trichome head. Everywhere, thousands of them in here. And in the middle, the chloroplast, right here it talks about this. It allows them to feed sugars up into the middle of the trichome head. And so it's kind of funny because we used to joke like, oh yeah, feed them sugars at the end. You're like, it's sugars aren't going to really do anything. But of course, a lot of us do stuff because we do notice an effect. And so sugars are being produced. And when plants produce sugars, it's an energy-intensive thing. There's a lot going on in there. That's why the sugar's going in. And these cells around here, what's happening, what he discusses in here is that in the center from that sugar production, they're trying to fix nitrogen. They're making nitrogen. And the reason why is the trichome is going to super oxidize these bacteria, basically trying to destroy them. And of course, our medicine is an antioxidant. It's a beneficial that's in there. Now, this is not in a finished trichome that we're washing. So this may not be a perfect example. These are in developing trichomes. Okay, at the end, it's kind of like full of oil. There may not be as much biology going on. Again, I'm not an expert on this. But in the developing trichome, there's this massive amount of activity happening where the biology is like, whoa, that super oxidizer is going to kill me. And so it says, no, I'm going to produce nitric acid instead and block it. And the plant's like, yeah, let's do that again and again. And it's this cycle. And so where I'm just thinking, we've discussed like maybe they're pesticides, maybe they grow them to stick to the bugs or whatever it is, right? A super oxidizer, if exploded, could probably be pretty antifungal too. And so maybe there is other benefits, I'm not really sure. There's different trichome sizes. Different plants have different stalk lengths, and there's different versions of trichomes. So who knows, maybe there's different functions and different types, but it's mind-blowing to me to think that there's bacteria inside the trichome head performing functions to give the plant nitrogen. And I'm like, oh man, is that why if you use nitrogen on accident in flour, you have no trichomes? Like, because they're not needed? Or is it completely irrelevant? I don't know. But one thing's for sure, we all want more trichomes. We're trying to grow those, not necessarily the plant matter. But then sometimes you get big heads, but they're not as good because it's waxier. And so I don't know how we can control this, but the fact that the plant is not sterile, it's full of biology inside our favorite part, just gets me so excited, leading back to the fact that maybe this mulching and the worms and all this biology stuff that we're driving towards, maybe it's even more important than I originally anticipated. Maybe it's more than just trying to use biology to solubilize nutrients for our plants so we don't have to use synthetics. I do think it's more. I got excited to set this down. Okay, so here's another view. This is the nitrogen fixation zone. This is the nitrogen transfer zone. And so from the center, the chloroplasts produce the sugars that fuel the process. Anyways, you should watch the video. It's freaking fascinating. Also, of course, if you haven't grown a lot of other plants, I think cannabis is kind of a gateway. Many of us grow every other plant ever after that because we're so fascinated. But there's tons of different types of trichomes on different plants. Tomatoes have them, and tobacco. Like, lots of plants use trichomes. So it would make sense that maybe these types of possibilities of nitrogen fixation or other endophytic bacteria that aid in the extraction of nitrogen could exist through these different plant types. And maybe cannabis, maybe it's lucky because it produced a way that happened to make us happy, where the other ones didn't, right? But they're all trying to achieve the same thing. I think it's pretty incredible. So Rhizophagy uses superoxides. For plants to produce superoxides, there must be oxygen in the soil. And so that does bring us back to, should we be aerating compost tea? Do we want to have enough oxygen in the soil? How do we make the right structure? If soil's so phenomenal, I've tried to dig up topsoil that's decent, put it in a container and grow a plant in it. It's very difficult. And that's why we put pumice and drainage. We're trying to maximize the opportunity because we're not tapped into this battery of the earth. And we really do have to alter the structure. But part of the beauty of making a potting soil is that I can get 50% organic matter tomorrow if I want, versus on the farm on 100 acres, that is a tall order. Most organic farms are 1% to 3%. And so there's a significant difference in nutrient holding and exchange and some of these biological processes that we can take advantage of because, man, if we're going to teach people to grow their own food, like 90% of us are probably going to have to do it on a patio. Not everybody has land. Okay, and when you overwater, this process goes away. So I don't know if like overwatering causes the process to stop somewhere else in the plant, but we all know that oxygen is important, and so it's just fascinating for me to think that superoxides take oxygen. They've got to produce a lot of this stuff, so if we're drowning them, well, shit, that's going to go away. That does make sense. So how do plants do it? Okay, so plants, therefore, whatever. This is a long thing basically saying that above ground, they're photoautotrophic, but below ground, they work in many different ways, and they can be heterotrophic, and that's really what I'm driving to. So plants' roots can eat anything they can reach. Salt ions, if they appear in originally pure drinking water, true minerals in the form of stone dust particles, amino acids, and entire large protein molecules, and also bacteria and other microorganisms, okay? Think about how humans will seldom burn fat, right? I talked about this until we switch over to ketosis. I just have noticed something within BuildASoil, just observing through the last decade of doing this, that nature mimics its processes in many ways. And so how it happens in one area, like humans, is probably how it's likely to happen in other areas. Not exactly the same, but it makes sense that if there's many ways that we can get nutrition, like I doubt people were thinking we should inject intravenous nutrition and live that way, right? But you can for a while. It's probably going to cause breakdown in other areas. And so if we can focus on more methodologies of feeding the plant, I feel like they're going to be healthier. And I try and relate it to that plant or that connection to human nutrition. Circling back a little bit, Rodale started organic gardening movement, okay? And it was inspired over in the UK. And Rodale was here in the United States, and he's like, dude, we got to do organic farming. William Albrecht and his crew of researchers at University of Missouri, we talk a lot about Albrecht for the soil balancing, cation exchange, all the stuff we use in the soil theory. He was developing the new mineral basis for the new agriculture. That's where the Ideal Soil book comes from that I like to reference, and that's all about balancing cations. Well, at that time, Charles Walters started Acres USA. If you haven't checked out Acres USA, phenomenal book resource. You can geek out, tons of good books. But that entire company was set up just to promote Albrecht's ideas and to literally get organic farming out there in a different way. And so he called it eco-agriculture, okay? Organics became split at this time, I believe still is, between biodynamics, permaculturists, soil food web, and all these different factions. Most of us in here, we're just trying to do the best of all of them. And I really do notice that when I talk to people. It can feel on the internet like we're so deep within these subsects that we can't see anything any other way. But I think we just go down rabbit holes at different points in time, and we're learning about it, so we want to discuss it and talk about it. But most of us can clearly see that blindly following only one of these is going to leave more on the table that we could benefit from, okay? And let's see, it's time we brought it all back together. It really seems that living soil growers have united the best from all these factions. And soil that is minerally balanced, full of organic matter, will serve as the best foundation for all of nature's tools to feed plants. This is why soil balancing works. And this is why soil balancing also isn't always needed. And so it's important that we interact all of these together, okay? The other thing I like to think about is that there's an agreement between man and nature. And a lot of us feel that way when I discuss what's important in life. It's more than just profiting or just taking from the soil, more than just feeding our family. It's like a nature agreement. That's why I talk about multiple generations. And that it's been broken. Like with mankind and cattle, for example, we provide protection, shelter, warmth, good food, good water. We care for their young. We help them when they're injured and sick. And we work to improve their breed, okay? And for that, we get milk, meat, hides, manure, labor, all these things. It's always been a two-way street. With plants, okay, same thing. We're here to husband the land, provide care, protection from competing plants, fertile soil, abundant clean water, and we're working to improve their breed. For that, we get nourishment through healthy crops. We build healthy soil for future generations and a healthy ecosystem to live in. And I feel like the current agricultural system has broken that agreement. Most of us believe that this is true. We should be taking care of the land and it should give back to us. And that could be sustainable in perpetuity as opposed to the other method. So what do we do, right? What's the solution? It doesn't have to be through BuildASoil. None of that matters. People follow us from all over the world. I want to teach them to be independent, not dependent on some company. But we call it the BuildASoil way. Living soil cultivation, where all of the organic methods intersect. Most of us are trying to take the best from everything and apply it. It's just we have to learn about them individually to take it serious. You can't just jump into permaculture and throw half the design models out the window. But hugels and beds and all that, like it's freaking amazing. People try and do hugel culture indoors. We're all tinkering. It's fun. The evolution of living soil. So this is where like maybe the rubber really meets the road for me. I want to see how much time we have left because I really want to make sure that we get into Q&As. And I know I have a couple hours. So it's been 1 hour. Before I jump into the next section, I went over a lot of stuff. And some of it's over my head. I was just trying to share with you that over history, this has already been literally found out, talked about, discussed, was very important, then shoved down because of chemical theory, and we all just were all in on it. And now it's all resurging back. And so there's tons of old books that you can find with old studies. And part of the next series for our YouTube, I'd really like to demonstrate some of these for fun, see if they're bullshit, see if they're not. But like you can grow in sand. The author of the book where I took some of that information is called Humisphere. It's a great book. He's discussing a lot of these topics. He would grow plants in sand, and he would feed them chlorophyll water by just blending up green, like grass, and then straining it and only feeding the green water and getting full fruiting results out of it. And there's no NPK nutrition in it. And so it's very fascinating to see like how far can we isolate some of these experiments to see how nature might act. And it'd be really fun to do some of those side-by-sides. So I encourage some of you to look at the old school stuff. Any questions about that before I go on to the next part? Anybody have a question? Okay, good question. So he asked, has the bacteria been identified that's in the trichomes? And so as far as I know, if you go watch his lecture on there, more recently he said, someone asked the same question, and he said, yes, but I'm not going to talk about it. It's my undergraduate, I think it's his graduate student doing a thesis on it. And he says that she's isolated some of them, and it's very difficult to do because they live without oxygen, which apparently not every microbe that lives without oxygen is bad, right? There's facultative anaerobes. There's lots of fermentations and weird stuff that we've been doing at BuildASoil that should not work. Like it should kill your plants if you use these anaerobic ferments, but they slay. And so we're trying to figure out why. And so as far as his question, which bacteria are in there, it sounds like we're going to get more information about that soon. In fact, maybe I've just missed it and it already has been shared because this is in 2010. The more recent lecture I think I watched him talk about his student discussing the isolation of some of these microbes was in like 18 or 19. So it's possible that information's already out. I do know that he said that there's probably likely to be lots of different ones and lots of different ones in different trichomes of different plants and different even varieties of our plants. So good. Yeah, not on the testing. I was thinking the same thing. They're going to shut us down for that now, right? Which is funny, right? So he was talking about testing, and in a commercial capacity, it's like, man, they just identify microbes, and who knows if they're bad, good, right? Like nature has reasons for this stuff. We're constantly finding more out, but they can shut us down over it. It's fucking crazy. What's up?
Any idea what the undergrad student's name?
No.
What university?
Nothing.
Okay.
Yep. Sometimes I go all the way. Sometimes I'm like, well, that's fascinating. Next. All right, so any other questions? Okay, we'll have plenty of time at the end. The evolution of living soil. So for me, on the forums, of course, everybody's trying to research these things, but there's lots more that was done in certain aspects on the forums, and many growers make it their duty to like take one particular method as far as they can. And that's great because we all get to learn from it. We get to watch them do stuff that maybe we don't have the time to do, and I love that. So organics, biodynamics, high brix, soil food web, permaculture. We're going to go through a few of those just quickly, all right? Super soil, subcool. When I was starting, this was the Rev, True Living Organics. Super soil was a little more prevalent for me. I did tinker a little bit with some of this, but super soil at the beginning was like, well, that's a proven recipe. We'll talk about why. We'll talk about some of the ingredients. True Living Organics, and then Coots recipe. Coots recipe was different at the time compared to the laundry list of recipes of living soil you could make from scratch. And I know it's not native soil. We're discussing container gardening, or even if you have a backyard garden, building a raised bed. And if you want to have full production that year, instead of working your land to be soil that's worth it, you can get it instant gratification by mixing a potting soil. And so we were fascinated by that. We thought, oh my God, subcool is watering and that's it. Doesn't have to pH, doesn't have to do any of this, and you're getting those nugs. I'm like, I'm in. I told my grocery store guy, I'm like, where's that stuff? He's all, man, that stuff doesn't sell. I got a couple down to earth boxes in the back. You can order the rest online. And I was like, don't worry about it. I'll figure it out. So we tried all of these methods, and it still continues. We're tinkering all the time. But the Coots recipe, we'll discuss it. And then we lab tested mostly through our customers that were utilizing these. A lot of people were doing super soil at a commercial level at that time. They were dumping their old pots out back. They had the super soil. They were making their own batches. And they were like, fuck it, let's send off for a soil test. What does it say? And so we got to see how basically it says no plant should be able to grow in it, and it was still slaying. So we'll discuss some of that. And then the evolution of ingredients by the investigations that Coot taught us. Now, Coot is a cantankerous old guy. He has a reputation for being kind of an asshole, and also people love him. So he's supported me since I started BuildASoil. He's let me rip off all of his ideas directly because we communicate all the time. And I think that he kind of vicariously lives through me. Like, you can tell he likes, like, man, people are doing the Coot stuff. That's great. But he helped a lot of us because he was that way. And he was like, dude, you got to read the label. Like, that's bullshit. Or let's figure out what's going on there. And he taught me how to investigate labels and ingredients, and that a lot of times it wasn't even on the label. And that was important because for me, I did that at the grocery store, for sure. I just did not know how to do it in gardening. None of the words made any sense to me. And he made it make sense. So we're going to discuss a little bit of that stuff, okay? Comparing methods, okay? So I'm not going to spend too much time on each one, but this is the organic method, okay? They lack a process for soil mineral balancing. The typical organic gardening is just more compost, more compost, more compost. And the argument from a soil balancing side is, hey, if your property is really missing something, because we don't get the luxury of just going and picking the best farm property and putting a stake in it. Some of us have to work with really bad soil. And so the organic method may leave some key component out without initial investigation. That could be harder depending on where you are in the world. So that's one thing. They lack a process for indoor and urban gardeners. Of course you can grow organic. Everybody knew that, but when I started growing, they're like, yeah, you can't do that indoors. You can't do that. Sorry, you can't bring compost in, you'll bring bugs. And so I was like, oh, but I want to do organic. Soil health, okay, the main focus is on increasing organic matter. That's it, not really mineral composition. Crop rotations, cover crop, yeah, all that's good. And there's some amazing organic trials about how the anti-fragility of it allows them to produce more over a 30-year period than a conventional farm, because on the drought year, guess what? Organic has organic matter. They're holding water. They're crushing. So organic totally has a place, okay? And they also avoid synthetic inputs and GMOs. Soil food web. I'm not an expert on soil food web, but I bought a microscope. I got fascinated by all of the different work out there. At the time, on the forums, many of us were following Tim Wilson, Microbe Man, and he was argumentative about a lot of the theories at the time from the soil food web. He was selling DVDs on how to investigate the microorganisms, and he was teaching us different compost tea recipes. A lot of us were brewing teas, but he was like, those are nutrient teas. Compost tea is just about biology. And instead of focusing on biology, I ended up focusing on creating the good environment for them. We call this building the birdhouse. You don't have to learn how to build a bird or look for birds. You build a birdhouse. The birds come. They fight over it. They'll kill each other over it. They want the birdhouse. You build a good soil. You balance it. The microbes proliferate. You add moisture. It's uncanny. Beautiful. Lots of biology. Of course, I don't want to wait 5 years. I don't want to make sure that I lose my crop. I care. I'm not going to just avoid whether the microbes are good or bad. I had fun with the microscope. But I don't want a brand new grower to think, oh, fuck, I got to go buy a microscope before I grow my first crop, okay? I got to make compost. That's going to take a year, okay? That's not necessary. You don't need that to grow plants. The other thing that I just can't stop from thinking is that there's trillions of microbes we don't know shit about, and these 100 I'm supposed to think are God. And I'm just like, I know balance is important. I know we can see a lot there, but I'm just not sold that it's everything. I think it's a big part of the puzzle, okay? Nature's antifragile in this regards, and the microbial world as viewed in a microscope slide has too many variables for us to comprehend. And I always tell myself this to try and be honest with myself. One Straw Revolution, Masanobu Fukuoka, really I hear him in the back of my head from reading his book like, bro, you can't just go all in on the most narrow scientific focus. You got to remember, nature has some tricks you don't even know about. You're looking at this, it's doing something else a different year. The next, right? There's more than one way, okay? Instead, focus on building good soil with balance and organic matter. You'll have the perfect home for your biology. This way, even if you brew it perfectly, it doesn't just die. You have a good home for it. That's the most important part of the BuildASoil way. And then you don't need a microscope for that. Again, mineral balance the soil, build the organic matter, and microbes will be abundant, similar to building a birdhouse, okay? Other thing about this, I briefly touched on it. There's an argument of aerobic versus anaerobic and the exclusion of anaerobic. I believe, ideally, we use both. I was kind of against it in the beginning. We were brewing compost tea. I had a microscope, dissolved oxygen count, vortex lifter, spiraling, every kind of freaking compost tea brewer you can think of. I've tried to make a version of it. It's so much fun. It's like Legos. And then you get the microscope. Like, don't get me wrong, I had fun with it. But when you're doing that, and someone tells you that these ferments or anything anaerobic won't work, it'll kill plants, you're like, well, man, the hash maker I know is fire, and all he uses is ferments, so I don't know how that could be true. And so I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just saying it can't be that one is terrible and one is good. There's got to be a place for both. And so I utilize it in many ways. I have a lot of theories about this, but through the hemp farming craze in western Colorado, I learned that pH was very different, right? Like, we weren't talking about pHing our water when we grew in living soil, because we all use clean water. But when I was dealing with farmers and they have dirty ditch water, I was like, oh shit, we have to acidify all the alkalinity and bicarbonate in the water because they have terrible water. It's not really trying to pH the 100 acres. It's just that every time we put dirty water on the soil, it binds up the nutrients because there's no organic matter, no biology. It was a huge issue. And so I'm thinking, man, these ferments would slay for an acidifier. They're like 3.5 pH. You can make them for free. And I'm like, Jadam! They already do this. And so I think there's more to it than just the fermentation. There's like so many benefits to utilizing microbes when you start to understand it as a tool, not the end-all, be-all. There's different tools for different jobs, okay? High brix. This is one that helped me a lot. I would say that I stayed away from like trying to grow a high brix plant, but how many people have heard of high brix in the room? Right? Like trying to grow with a sweet sugar sap. And you start reading about it and you're like, this is it. It makes sense. You're like, if the sugar sap is higher, the plant has to be healthier because sugars are harder to make. That means they have everything they need and no bug will touch it. And I know that, of course, they probably don't teach it that way, but it comes off that way. Like if you're high brix, and you can measure that with your brix meter, which I'll talk about briefly if you don't know what that is, you for sure aren't going to have any pests. You have a healthy plant. And I think pests love healthy plants too. So, of course, if you are a healthy human, you're probably not going to get sick. It just doesn't mean that it's impossible. And so I like to make sure that we discuss that. What I learned from brix that was helpful was when we were doing soil testing, the original Coots recipe, very high on the saturated paste test in potassium and sodium. Couldn't believe it. I'm like, well, how's the plant going to grow? It's 30%, just potassium and sodium, and calcium's so low. But you look at the soil test, it's pretty good on calcium. So we learned more. But guess what? The plants, you plant into it, they get used to it for a couple days, and they'd slay. And so we started testing the soil regular, and then I'd run water through it in a 1-gallon pot, test the same soil. A lot of those saturated paste test problems disappeared with one rinse of water. And so sometimes I'm like, man, I wonder if the chlorides are that high or if just it's a fresh batch and literally no water has even gone through it. That's part of why I think some of these soils work well, even though they may not look like it, is like we kind of start moving through that soil pretty quickly. Some of these problems fall off. But the high brix, I noticed like, okay, you're never going to get high brix if your calcium's low, your potassium's super high, and your sodium's high. Just that's not what they advocate for. And so when we started testing it, we realized that it wasn't the inputs that was really making up the saturated paste test. It was the compost. And so I know that, of course, people are like, well, what's the biology in your compost? And I'm like, well, if you put it in the sun, it's going to go down. If you put it in a box and ship it, it's going to change. From minute to minute, it can change. I mean, if you ever grown sourdough, it's like, man, you wait an hour and too warm, the whole fucking dough's like it goes quick. And so I worry more about the chemical profile of the soil. The biology is going to be rich if there's tons of food source in there and the moisture's right and there's all of the different sources for these organisms to eat. It's a literal buffet of organic material for them to eat. But if it's high in sodium and potassium, it's probably going to change the dynamic profile of the microbials, which isn't good, and it's probably going to be bad if you add 30%. The original recipes we were making were like 30, 40% compost. And so if you got the wrong compost, you're going to have a terrible time. And we really started to learn about that. And it was unfair advantage because hydro, you could be like, hey, I'm on the West Coast, you're on the East Coast, what's your pH, what's your EC, what's your water you're using? Bam, we're dialed. We can talk same language. Tell a guy to go grab a pile of compost and mix it and say you're going to get good results. It could be absolutely terrible. Nobody knows what good compost is when they first start, and everybody selling you compost has the best. And then they share with you like a chemical analysis of it, and I've looked at some. They proudly show it to me, and I'm like, oh my God, this is atrocious. And they're like, oh, it's good. That's why we got the test. So sometimes even the person selling you the compost doesn't know what's in it. But high brix taught me that. I wouldn't have known had I not pursued that path, that we could maybe get a better impact right out the gate by doing some modifications. And then for those that don't know, the brix is a degree, it's a measurement of the sap. So you take the leaf and you squeeze them. And there was a whole conversation about doing sap testing, and it goes way, like brix is one light item. They go hard on it now. So you can go way further than just brix. Biodynamic farming. I don't want to spend too much time here, but it's a lot more spiritual relationship. I mentioned a little bit of this. Some of it's a little bit kooky. A lot of people agree that it's a lot more like woo-woo as opposed to very science-based. However, I find it fascinating that a lot of it, without knowing, comes around and you're like, oh, wow, foliar spraying silica does make a lot of sense. Some of these things they do, but I also don't want to like biodynamically stir my compost the same way every day. There may be spiritual benefit to that, but a lot of us are like running a business, or we just want to get like to the point. Biodynamics will bury horns under the ground and all these things. Well, I'm sure the compost is great. The argument might be like, do you have to do that? And so I like biodynamics. I'm not trying to take away from it, but these are common conversations in the community about what are the best parts, which ones do you really have to do? And maybe that ruins biodynamics. I don't know. But I'm not running a vineyard. I'm not doing the full biodynamic process indoor. I'm taking from it my favorite parts. We use a biodynamic compost via Malibu. I'm not positive if the biodynamic inputs are really what makes its magic. Part of me thinks it's just the manure, just the magic of the cow's stomach, and them properly composting it. But we do use some of that stuff. Another thing is they do focus on cosmic rhythms, like planting calendars with lunar cycles. Personally, I've not, like, the fact that I know I can grow without a lunar cycle, and it turns out good, is hard for me to go against, but I also know people that follow it, and they're phenomenal growers. And I think what all those people have in common is they love their plants, and they take this thing serious. And to me, those are people that produce good results, right? And there may be some correlation there. Permaculture. Now, to me, this is organics with a system. And a lot of times, unfortunately, what's lacking in business or in garden or in farming is some sort of system, some sort of operating procedure. And so a lot of people take permaculture because they have very set systems. They're all about caring for the earth, caring for the people, and your fair share, and not overdoing it, returning, sharing. Also design principles. So you're going to be managing, you're going to do earth movement. You're going to manage the moisture on your property. You're going to understand the entire ecological cycle. Little bits of this can absolutely be used as far as the critical thinking that's gained with this to adapt to whatever system you have. I may not be able to build a swale for my indoor grow tent, but I can learn some of the permaculture principles by maybe collecting rainwater, using that in my grow. There's things we can take from permaculture that I really, really like, and I think it's a phenomenal system. This is where we get into more like the cannabis side and what BuildASoil went through as far as testing. And so super soil, for those of you that don't know, is Subcool's soil recipe. And Subcool was famous for sharing this with the world. And I'm sure at that time, he was copying other recipes from everyone. And it became the super soil, his recipe, right? We talked a number of times about the ingredients in there because BuildASoil wrote kind of a flaming article on super soil. At that time, we were being taught by our mentors online that, hey, most of these ingredients aren't, like, you shouldn't use them. Or there's redundancies. But the reason why it was so important, it was developed at a time when growing cannabis was a lot more illegal than now. And the entire recipe was based on ingredients anybody could find at their local garden center, right? There was no BuildASoil. There was not a lot of the companies where you could find rare organic ingredients. And we didn't even know how to ask for them, let alone sell them. So you could get the super soil recipe. You could go to the local garden store. You can go to Walmart, like a few places, and be like, okay, got that, got this. Go online for one of those. Bam, I'm ready to make super soil. And so it was a recipe that allowed them to use it and use slow release organics to finally try water only. But the style was to mix a super hot soil with bagged soil, load it with every nutrient because we didn't know which ones were right or wrong, and just go hard on it, load it with biology. And then you actually created that and set it aside in a tarp and let it kind of like cook and come together and get hot because of all the nutrients and it microbially come alive. But then you couldn't plant into it. You had to put it on the bottom of your pot and you'd put a fresh bagged soil on top. The idea is that you plant your plant into it, and now you're not going to burn your roots. It's fine, and it can kind of gently put its roots into this hot soil and eat from it. And it totally works. People slayed with it, but some genetics hated it. Sometimes it just went wrong, and you could not fix it because you were so loaded. So a lot of us said, well, in nature, all the shit falls on top, like the leaves and the worms and the dead animals and the minerals. Like a lot of that stuff that's organic rich material and might be fertilization is on top, not in the bottom. So let's try that. But how do we do it when we've already planted? So we started using soil that weren't so hot, just balanced. And it's crazy. You can top dress and the plants literally eat it as long as it's moist. And so you're like, well, if that works, then why do we do it the other way? So a lot of these living soil theories were like, well, maybe we shouldn't mix it all together. It causes more problems than it hurts. And so we started testing the super soil. And right now, if we see a soil test come back, let's say 600 to 1,000 on phosphorus on a Logan Labs test, and maybe the same in potassium. We were seeing them 3, 4, 5,000 on the phosphorus levels coming back on some of these super soils. Just astronomical from continuing to load. And the plants were still growing, but some of them hated it, some of them were okay. And so really what I thought is that soil testing is great for identifying excesses that make it much harder for the plant to do its natural job. It's just like smothered in this. And I'll get there to the Earthbox, but we found some cool techniques about how if it had access to clean water, it wasn't forced to just be in the nutrient-rich zone, the plant can start to pick and choose intelligently on its own, and it's fascinating. And it led to a further belief about how plants might eat instead of just drink water-soluble ions. So growers would put the hot soil, we talked about that. And then consider that super soil is still taking advantage of feeding the Edaphon. Okay, it's just that it can create imbalance in water-soluble ions. It's a little bit too much, and now the plants have to sit in some of this because there's nowhere else to drink water from. But it's still feeding biology because that's why the pile gets hot. It's all organic amendments, okay? Next, true living organics. This is interesting because in super soil, you use like a 20, 30 gallon pot. It was kind of like, okay, well, we're going to have a lot if we're going to do water only with big plants. And it's a super rich soil. But the Rev was like, yo, you can do this in little pots. You can put little spikes of nutrients. We can layer it so that the plant gets access to these through different times. And it still worked, even though people were like, you don't need spikes and layers, and people are making fun of it because we all judge each other on the forums and say what you're doing is wrong, what I'm doing is right. And he would use stuff like 555 organic care, poultry litter, green sand, oyster shell, dolomite lime, blood meal, guano, feather meal, bone meal, bulb food, soft rock phosphate, gypsum, steer manure, humic acid, rock phosphate. And so you're like, well, what's bulb food? And what's the 555? And you'd read them, you're like, oh, it's more of these same ingredients. And so it was clear we were just throwing the kitchen sink at it. And it was all stuff that had worked. It was like, this worked, so I used it. That worked, so I added it. But when you're trying to build from scratch, you're like, well, do I have to buy bulb food or can I buy some of these? Like, how's that work? And so many living soil growers were now thinking, okay, I got this. I'm going to get some good ingredients, and I can do this on my own. I don't need these laundry lists. But, you know, when you're first learning to grow, you're like, whatever homie did, I'm doing exactly that. I got the list. Nope, I'm shopping for this. I don't care what you say. So many of us have gone through that. I think it's easier to talk about now. I do want to get into some of these ingredients, and maybe we'll do some of that in the Q&A, but we do not use any bone meal anymore. We use a fish bone meal, but man, I started learning. I went to the store, buying a lot of these ingredients to copy these recipes so I could experience this for myself, not just judging it. And I was like, okay, bone meal says organic on there, right? And I look it up. There's no organic bone meal in the United States. All the soil manufacturers that are using feather meal, bone meal, blood meal, they feel okay about it, but I don't. And the reason why is I'm adamant that the GMO, Roundup, pesticide-sprayed crops are ruining our fucking soil. And when you see that the slaughterhouse waste, there's two sides, right? Like, oh, organics can take waste stream and utilize them. That's good, but I don't want any of that shit in my weed. And I don't want to support those industries. And what I mean by that is it says organic bone meal, but it came from the worst slaughterhouses feeding GMO corns to animals that shouldn't be even feeding grain and treating them terribly. And then the waste stream gets steamed and sold as organic bone meal. It's not organic. It's approved for organic use. And there's a huge fucking difference. Poultry manure. I like chickens. I fucking love chickens. I have a whole bunch of them. They eat everything. It's amazing. You don't even have to feed them feed. They eat bugs and everything else. We feed them good feed because you get a higher production level. So if you're in business and you want tons of eggs, you're going to feed them the highest production level for the lowest amount of cost. And then everything produced from that, you're like, no. I got organic chicken manure. We're good. These chickens are free range. We love them. There's none. I had one company in Western Colorado with his own truck that would only go to organically fed chicken farms to process the pellets. That guy went out of business, or at least is too busy for me to deal with, and all of the other major brands. Stutzman's, I mean, they make a good product, but it comes from the worst slaughterhouses. There's antibiotics found in it because they're feeding these animals, and it just conglomerates together. And so you can use poultry manure, no problem, but don't fool yourself. It is not organic. It's coming from the worst GMO. I mean, it just pisses me off. Like, even in our kids' cereal, they're eating this shit, and they're getting Roundup in their blood. And so I'm not thinking I'm smoking weed because it had bad manure that I'm getting Roundup in my system, but it's fucking possible. And the fact that it's even going in there, it bothers me. Blood meal, same way. You can use it though, right? Blood meal's good. It works. Bone meal's good. It works. If you have an organic source, I would suggest using it. I'm not saying the material itself is bad. I just think that there's a burden of knowledge that comes with it. And the way that I choose the food that I eat for myself and my family, I pay attention to that a lot. And I'm hypocritical sometimes because of the choices that are given to me. But when I know that and there's other choices, I just choose those. And so that's a big reason why some of these super soils and true living organics, we change the ingredients, we change the recipes. And what's so cool is it's like you're making a salad. You can change the lettuce, croutons, like it's still a salad and people still enjoy it. But in the beginning, when you don't know, you're thinking you have to do everything exactly this way or it won't work. And that's just totally not true. So we avoid most of those ingredients, but at the end of the day, it still worked. And that's what I really want to say is all these things worked. It's fucking crazy. And they're very different from each other, and they still got good results. And there was no soil testing going on here. We were just taking potting soil and loading it with nutrients, and the plants found a way to produce some phenomenal photo-worthy results. I mean, of herb that's good. And so it's kind of hard to argue with the fact that you're just doing things that didn't make a ton of sense and still getting really good results. And I have to remind myself, like, we're not so much better just because we do things different. Like, all this shit works. Okay, back now to the Coots recipe. So if you don't know, it was just so easy, I think is why part of it perpetuated. But I'm trying all these complicated recipes. You got to understand, before you could just buy some of this stuff in a kit or whatever, like TGA, Subcool did try to release a soil, but it goes anaerobic. It caused problems. It's hard with all those amendments. But to source it, you're like spending a month and spending so much money and buying 50-pound bags and 5-pound, all this shit just to make it. And Coots like, you don't need any of that. You just take peat moss, 1 part, pumice, 1 part, and compost, 1 part. His was worm castings that he worked all the nutrients through. That's it. And you'd grow in it. I'm like, no fucking way, that won't work. And his amendments that he processed through the worms, he didn't like to mix directly in the soil, but it does work. He would work it through the worm bin. He would only add a cup of kelp meal, a cup of neem meal, and a cup of a mixture. And in the beginning, it was just a 3-way lime of like dolomite, oyster shell flour, and gypsum. Now, most of us just use gypsum and oyster. And that was it. So you'd have a cup of kelp, a cup of neem, a cup of crustacean meal, and you'd have your mineral mix, to which we'd add 4 cups per cubic foot. And he recommended rock dust. He used glacial rock dust in the beginning, and then he came to like basalt. But I mean, it was so basic. Basalt and kelp were all your micronutrients. The neem cake was your seed meal. Protein, NPK, some of those items. And of course, you have to have good compost. That was really the bulk of it. The rest was just using those minerals to make sure that, hey, if you're going to make worm castings and you don't have some rock dust and some kelp, you're probably going to miss some micronutrients. This was just a way to make a all-natural version of something that had everything. And it was at that time that I found out about Steve Solomon and his book. And in that book, The Intelligent Gardener, he teaches you how to make your own complete organic fertilizer. And it's such a simple recipe. A seed meal, a phosphorus source, a micronutrient source like kelp or rock dust, and it's basically done. He gives you a couple ways to make it. And I went, oh my God, Coot just took the Steve Solomon liming mix, chose a couple of his favorite ingredients, and made a complete organic fertilizer. And then he didn't overdo it. He just barely put a little in. Bigger container of soil, one of the healthiest grows I ever had in my life. And in that first one, it was exclusively gypsum. I couldn't find any oyster shell. I since experimented, and anyways, it blew my mind that something so simple could work so well when I've been doing all these really convoluted, complicated recipes. And there's a lot of information on this recipe. We sell kits to make it. Every one of these kits sends money to Coot, and he's retired on a fixed income, so him and his wife benefit greatly when people buy his kits. And I think it's just fucking awesome. It's like part of the whole synergy of what we've been doing since the beginning, and literally it's changing people's lives. So One Straw Revolution is one of the biggest parts of BuildASoil starting as far as some of my beliefs coming from this. So if you haven't done so, Even if you just heard about it, like it is an easy read. I highly recommend getting it. It doesn't read like a textbook, it reads like a story, and it really gets you questioning science. Even though I leverage science for soil testing, like you just can't afford to think that one way is all right. And when a scientist starts a farm and does literally nothing and shares his lessons with you about how to build soil in a different way, you have to pay attention. And it really kicked off a big revolution around the world in no-till farming. So, he also reminds you of the dangers of trusting narrow science. Multiple causality in nature really drove it home that like the etymologist would come and he's like, oh, this bug's gonna get you this year. He's like, the guy'd leave in 3 hours and he didn't realize that some other bug's gonna come eat that. Next year was a different bug and I never had a problem. But when your whole job is to look at just the bugs, he's like, you're fucked. You know, I seen this bug, you're going down. And it mirrors what I've seen in organic gardens where maybe they have a problem. Maybe they even have like some of the new diseases in plants, but they're not taken down. Like they can finish somehow. So nature's strong that way. The book helped start BuildASoil, instilling confidence in these natural methods of mimicking nature. Fukuoka says nature is whole and complete. It is only humans that pick it apart with our divisive knowledge, categorizing it into good and bad, useful and harmful. Reminds me of the bacteria. A lot of them we thought were terrible, and now we think they're good. They have purposes. And yet science rages on endlessly on, all the way up to chaos theory and the butterfly effect, and the point where even scientists are beginning to suspect that they once had a healthy, cohesive world as a partner. Fukuoka, no cultivation, okay? No fertilizer, no weeding, no pesticides. You're like, yeah, right, it's a dream. But he did this, and it was through a lot of intelligent process. It wasn't just doing nothing. No amount of research can teach man everything there is to know about the soil. Like, I'm never going to know it all. I'm not even going to pretend to. And I don't need to know any more than I currently know. The methods work. It's fun to dream about, though, okay? Okay? Because nature itself is perfect. If anything, advances in scientific research teach man just how perfect and complete a handful of soil is and how incomplete human knowledge is. When crops are planted in small earthenware pots or artificial enclosures, the soil in which they grow is dead soil. The growth of trees whose roots are boxed in by concrete is highly unnatural. It is unreasonable to claim that because plants frown without fertilizer in such an enclosure grown poorly, they cannot be grown without fertilizers. That's referencing all these little studies they do in the scientific lab with little tiny pots and say, see, fertilizer made a difference. And he's like, it's not even how plants grow in nature. You're like preaching to the birds about flying and putting them in a cage. Let them fly. Like that, they can do it. And so he was very much into being very critical of the scientific revolution at the time. And soil without tillage and planted with crops suited for that region need no help. Now, that's kind of my problem. My plants aren't suited to grow in my basement. So we are now in control of lots of stuff that we shouldn't have to be in control of. I love sun-grown. I think that's really the way. But I also like fresh flavors. And I like growing things year-round because it's a hobby. So I take note of that, and we do things to care and provide husbandry in a different way when it's indoors, okay? But typically when like plants are grown in their region, like by a river where they're supposed to grow, they just don't need any help. They grow wonderfully. No fertilizer salesman needed. Jadam organic farming, I really think is like at the forefront. We can talk about K&F, and there's so many different things going on, but Jadam is fascinating to me because it kind of tipped it on its head. When we first started BuildASoil, Gil Carindang, there was a website, and Coots had referenced it, and a lot of us were making small-level fermentations and seeing benefit, learning how to make lacto. I posted an old video, and people thought I was going to like die because who knows what bacteria I'm getting out of the milk and putting on my plants, and turns out, yeah, they know exactly what they're doing. Milk has lacto in it, and it's pretty safe. But just the fear of the biology was very real at that time. We were all scared, like, how do you know, you know? But Jadam, if you don't know, you got to go check it out. Go Google Jadam, find the PDF. You'll find a free download somewhere because it's so open source that they just share it. Open source teaching, BuildASoil is huge in that same thing. No use of biological components, heavy use of biological components that are all made on your farm, okay? No soil testing. In fact, if you follow some of the Jadam teachings, he's like, look, you can't tell a farmer who doesn't follow anything to go take 50 soil tests that he does all wrong. Then he sends it to the lab, and then he sends it to you in your office, and you go, okay, now this is the gospel truth, and this is exactly what you should do. He's like, dude, there's 30 feet of soil under there. There's all these other things at play. So Jadam does not focus on mineral balancing at all, yet they get phenomenal results. And so I'm not willing to throw mineral balancing away. I have to build potting soil for a lot of our customers, and I don't want it to be shit. But when you have native soil and these processes work, it really makes you scratch your head, right? It really does. And they focus on organic pest control, which is one of their big things, right? So we could talk about that for days, and I don't have days. So let's see, 6:02. Got 30 minutes. I'm going to speed through. We're getting closer to the end because I really want to do some questions. Soil testing for mineral balancing, okay? If the mineral theory is wrong, why do we apply it to organic soil testing? Okay, I still do, but I always like to ask questions. It's about starting the ideal balance as mimicked in the type of soil we actually want based on what we want to produce. Then we start the next part of the process. And I've mentioned that, okay? When you're starting a farm like here, it made sense. This is probably not the best soil to start with. What's in it? Let's find out. Let's be proactive about that, and let's build up from there. But we certainly don't just stop after the first application from a soil test. Native soil versus potting soil, some huge differences there in the soil testing. So when you send it off to the lab, if you've learned a little bit about soil testing, they've kind of just agreed there's a certain weight to topsoil across the whole country. They say, okay, well, 1 acre is about 2 million pounds. So there we go. And we're going to use this little thimble, little tiny, tiny little thimble of a scoop, and they're going to scoop that much soil for your whole area, and they're going to measure that for a soil test. And I'm like, well, that can't be very accurate. So then we mix our samples together to make sure we get a homogeneous amount. And then we find out, okay, there's a saturated paste test where they use more. But then you find out, well, they could shake it for longer, they could shake it for shorter, and they could mess something up. Do they grind it? Do they grind it all up? Do they screen some stuff out? Each lab has different practices. And you're like, well, fuck, how do I use any of this? So it adds more kind of convolution. That's why I think if you're going to do mineral testing, it's important to use the same lab, use a trusted professional because they've learned a lot of these practices. But potting soil is different. You take a little thimble of potting soil and we just mixed it. There could be stuff you're missing, you're not seeing. And despite all of that, it still seems to come back in fairly accurate, which is uncanny. But I know it's not seeing everything. And so it's important that you know more of the story behind the soil than just blindly trusting that test. We've learned a lot about that. Native soil also goes much deeper than 6 inches. Okay, we don't have that benefit with potting soil. So that mineral theory and having some balance there, like I'm not going to just do a crop cycle in between on my 4x4 bed and pull up minerals from 20 feet down. Like I don't have that opportunity. So it does become a little more important, but it's much easier to apply on small scale. Native soil often needs something crucial before closing the loop. And so a lot of the methodologies we referenced are talking about closing the loop, like in permaculture. No outside sources coming in. You can be fully sustainable. But to me, it makes a ton of sense in the world that we live in with less than ideal soil that most of us would deal with to investigate before we close the loop, make sure there's nothing missing from the system, and then close the loop, okay? Potting soil, it's mixed media. One of the limitations on there was we're trying to measure from what Albrecht taught the cation exchange, which is a magnetic ability for soil to hold nutrients. And in potting soil, it's different. There's some clay in there that can do it if you add it, but a lot of it is all about the organic matter. And we could spend hours just on this, but the CEC is all about colloids and how the nutrients hold there so the plants can supposedly use them. But organic matter has humus, and that's also a colloid, and it can hold on to nutrients and give it and receive them. And so a lot of us are like, well, that's too frustrating, so we'll just pretend like the potting soil is the same as native soil when we interpret these tests. But they're not quite the same. And then I already mentioned how we use the water-soluble test in potting soil because it's more accurate, because it's not real soil. But just a quick rinse alters it pretty quickly. And so that becomes kind of like, well, if I'm just looking at water-soluble but I have tons of biology, is that really fair? So questions get asked, right? I already mentioned what we saw in super soil, some of the really high numbers. And so what I've found is that soil testing is best for saying, look, that's too high, that's going to be a problem. Versus if it's low and we top dress, the plant can work itself out. The plant can feed itself in many different ways. Of course, on a native farm with no organic matter, it's even harder. So soil testing is more important, but in potting soil, we can jack the organic matter. Okay? I also talked about the excessive amounts of potassium and sodium we found in most composts when we're building potting soil. So most average compost, if you just go to your municipality or you find something local, instead of mixing 30%, try 5 and 10%. You usually get a lot better result with a compost that's not as good. When you go all in at 30, you better know what's in it. I don't care if it's the most biologically rich compost. You better know the chemical profile if you're going 30 to 40%. It's basically all it's going to be able to eat, and so it does change things. The ideal soil chart, if you want to look for this, you can just Google the ideal soil. It's widely available information. It's from a book. And a lot of this comes from many different practices of measuring cation exchange and healthy farms and how much nutrients the magnetic holding can hold. I see some of you trying to take pictures. It's going to be hard to see. I promise you can get this ideal soil chart at BuildASoil. I've got it for download. You can find the whole book for free, The Ideal Soil. But what I'm getting into is you start to get to the point where it gets a little ridiculous. And these do work, but it's a starting point. At some point, if you got this perfect and you plant a plant and it eats one bit of it, it's out of balance now. So no matter what on a soil test, you're going to always be having to add something. So I feel like we have to take it with a grain of salt. If there's something major, that gives us a plan of what to address, right? If you know that, hey, we've got a sodium issue, we're going to worry about leaching, we're going to worry about salt-tolerant crops going in first, it might actually steer you into permaculture properly instead of fumbling. So I'm not trying to say soil testing shit. I'm just like, man, it gets real weird real quick, and then it gets real out of weird. Like, there's some holes in the theory when you start thinking about it. So ideal soil. It's a chemical understanding of the results we found in productive soils. Does that mean we should apply chemicals or organic amendments to get there? Or instead, does this mean that growing the proper crops and tending to the life in the soil will create these results? Like, what's so crazy is if you've ever made a compost pile and let it settle for a long time, sometimes when, like, I've tested them at the lab and they tell you it'll settle at a certain pH, and you're like, wow, it came back at 6.4, exactly like they said. How did nature do it that way? By just carbon to nitrogen ratio. And it may not be the perfect mineral balance, but it's amazing how nature finds these levels that are good for them through natural processes. And a lot of times we're trying to copy that. And so should we just take care of soil, cover crop rotations, all these things? I believe yes. But if we don't have a few years to get there, understanding what nature's doing allows you to cheat a little bit. But it doesn't mean you can cheat forever. And so you still have to introduce these principles, okay? We believe combining these methods is mainly necessary to grow crops right away versus taking a long time to let nature do it. How to balance is the question, but what about the urban gardener? I really do think that a lot of the food issues is not the amount of food we can produce, but it's getting it to people. And I think that a lot of these techniques, although I saw it just for growing weed, I really think a lot of this is going to be important for us to grow rooftop gardens, patio gardens, and backyard gardens so we can give ourselves food that not only is more nutritious, but doesn't have the bullshit in it that's killing us. So, Earthbox experiments. Getting closer to the end, and I want to share with you some of the stuff that really helped me learn. The Earthbox experiments were fascinating to me, and I encourage you to get an Earthbox if you've never seen one. The next slide shows you what it looks like. Many people have seen these at the garden store. How many of you have seen or used an Earthbox before? Okay, so a lot of people. But if you haven't, underneath here is a tray that the soil sits on, and below it is clean water. And it has a reservoir, so you can't overfill it. It just dumps the water out if you try. So there's a few gallons of water, and there's only about 7.5 gallons of soil, maybe 10 gallons of soil in there. It's sitting above its own reservoir of water. And they use a mulch cover, which I don't like, but works really well in this small system because using mulch instead eliminates the ability to stack above. You can actually pack compost well above the side walls of that container because you never top water. With this reservoir, there's a tube you put water down. The reason why that's important is that I've tried experiments, okay, where we take a test, Earthbox 1, and we put balanced potting soil inside. We take another Earthbox, we take just peat and pumice. Then we put all the materials I would normally use to balance on top, right on top of the soil. Cover it with the plastic and water down the tube. Both have phenomenal results. The one on the non-mixed side has a slightly slower start until it hooks up and then it blasts. You don't even have to mix the nutrients. You can put gypsum over here, and you can put some of this over here. You can dig a trench and put some in. The fucking plant figures out how to drink clean water from down below, so it's not forced to drink water that's mixed with nutrients, and it can grow rapidly. But then it puts feeder roots into the top layer, and it starts to eat all the food that you put there. And so you're like, well, if balance is so important, how the hell did that work? And of course, it's not lacking, it was in there, and so it makes sense, but it becomes almost, as Alan Atkinson, who showed me these, like a stomach. And inside here, with the massive amount of biology happening, we get some of the most productive results for that volume of soil I've ever seen in my life. And every customer that uses one agrees. We all agree, like, man, I wish it was bigger and I could, like, do the cover crop and all this stuff. It doesn't really fit my personality, but, like, whoa, how does it do it? So we started measuring the moisture, and we found that these are significantly wetter through all of the soil than you'd think would be possible. Then you go, oh my God, the drip, the blue mat, all the stuff, proper watering, like, blows your mind when you get it right. That's because we're feeding the biology and we're properly husbanding the soil, providing the food and making sure they have everything they need to crush it. And it's wetter than I ever thought, borderline too wet, and it slays. And I can't get it out of my head that you can hide nutrients in different spots, and the biology working together with the roots finds a way when it shouldn't. And so that keeps my mind balanced that maybe perfection on a soil test isn't necessary, but making sure the buffet is full, making sure everything is there, maybe not in perfection, but maybe I don't have to be in full control. Maybe nature can work with me. Maybe the birds already know how to fly, okay? Why did it work? I mentioned all this stuff. I got ahead of myself. I just get too excited. Yeah, everything I said is already there. The access to the clean, nutrient-free water, I think, is an important step in biomimicry. When you see underground water that plants can tap into, they grow huge. A tree near a ditch, like any of that, it just goes bonkers. And then you're not watering every time through a location that evaporates, changes the biology in the surface layer. Something about that Earthbox just slays. And I hope I learn more about it in the future. Organic is more than mineral theory. If water-soluble ions are all that plants take up, why would any conventional farmer want to go organic? Like, if that really was true, why would we want to have to do compost and all this bullshit just to get the same nutrient salts as the guy who bought them for pennies? We know, like, all of us know there is a better way that doesn't ruin the soil, even if we can't specifically explain why, okay? And so that's an important distinction, is that I don't want to keep comparing organics just to the same nutrients the non-organic guy has to do. It keeps us stuck, I think. There's more than one way plants eat. The other thing is indoor and urban gardening. These new systems must adapt to container gardening so everyone can grow their own, not just people with land, as I realize not everyone has access to or is not in the right weather for it. And we have cool technology that can enable all of us in any weather, in any climate, to do what we want indoors. Maybe not perfectly, and I agree sun-grown is better, but I like, from a personal standpoint, to be able to do this. The BuildASoil way focuses on these indoor and urban gardeners with a system that works equally well in a market farm or a patio grow. We have both. We have a market farm, full production, following these techniques. You can see it everywhere here. There's no denying it. All the speakers, like, I don't even have to talk to you guys about that. This stuff works. The soil is the stomach for plants. Just like human health, biology lives in the root hairs, just like inside our stomach. There's an exchange of nutrients. You want to eat whole foods, real organic material. So if you are having any health crisis, or you've been wondering why am I not healthy, I think most of us know you have to eat foods you can read. You have to eat foods that your body can digest. You can't eat synthetic stuff, chemicals. All the shit you can't read needs to go. Your entire house needs to be cleaned out of all of those. If you treat your farm the same way, then you're going to have better biological response, because we're not killing the soil, which is the stomach of the farm. Same to human nutrition, okay? Clean water, good environment lighting, take care of the soil like we should take care of our guts, and plants grown this way will avoid many health issues similar to humans. Aristotle noted that soil acts as a plant's stomach, digesting and making food available. In soil, it's all about the beneficial microorganisms that play a crucial role in this process. So, plants and nutrient uptake, common misconception, they can only take up nutrients fully broken down into their chemical water-soluble form. Reality, many different ways, right? Plants are not exclusively autotrophic. They can also be heterotrophic. I've gone over this. I'm just going to drive it home. Endocytosis and Rhizophagy. There's probably others I don't know about. These are two that you can research that are so fun to research, okay? Plants can be heterotrophic. While it's taken for granted that endocytosis is an essential process in plants, with a key function in diverse processes ranging from nutrient uptake and receptor-mediated signaling to polarity establishment, it was for a long time considered impossible in plants due to the high turgor pressure they maintain. But now we know that that is not true. And that's huge. I just didn't know that. Researching it really opens your mind. Rhizophagy, plants farm the microbes. Biology can be heterotrophic. In 2010, this was published in Australia. Go watch the James White Rhizophagy videos if you haven't. It'll blow your mind. And then this one, according to Gerhardt in 1991, virgin soil contains practically no salt ions. And that corresponds with the idea that most organic substances are passed along in the form of larger organic building blocks, such as proteins, or even as living nutrient sources in the form of bacteria, fungi, amoebas, and algae, long before they are broken down into salt ions. They are not decomposed by the plants, but rather transformed. It's part of what I wanted to drive home for the BuildASoil way. Stomach first to soil. So now we're learning that feeding on our gut microbiome foods rather than we're just eating energy. Knowing that proper feeding of organic materials that led to the healthiest gut is the goal, and not just eating whatever processed food tastes good. Feeding processed foods, or worse yet, antibiotics, can ruin the gut and select for microbes that get out of balance. What's interesting is people say, look, there's still microbes in my farm where I have synthetics. You're like, yeah, selected for that. There's still microbiome in your gut when you take antibiotics. Guess what? Only the ones that live there under that situation. That's not what we want. We want a healthy balance. So the argument that stuff still lives, nature lives everywhere. It's ubiquitous. You're not going to kill it all. It's just that it may not be what actually creates a healthy body or a healthy system. Okay, it's not difficult. Soil tests to identify key problems and swiftly return to balance and then stop ruining it. The Edifon create the living soil. I want to get to the end, so basically, you can make really high organic matter soil. You can copy some of this really quickly. We're on 100 acres, it might be a lot harder. So that's part of the benefit. And creating raised bed potting soil, you can take advantage. Bringing it all together. Mixing potting soil allows us to create soil with high organic matter, proper pore spacing. We can fill it with nutrient-providing material and multiply the Edifon that continue to build our soil. Initially, we use the power of mineral balancing instead of just hoping that the soil will eventually correct itself, especially in a commercial setting. And then, to this balanced soil, we can now start the mulch layer, biological processes that will continue to feed it. It's all about feeding the biology. Like I said, in the magic of the Earthbox, how does it do that? Uniting us all, compost tea, like I had more stuff I want to talk about, just conversational. But the goal is not to prove one method. It's to unite them all, okay? 3 food types I want to talk about real quick. First stage would be just nutrients, like any dry amendment. But when we shop at BuildASoil, we mentioned, I don't want to look for potentially approved for organic stuff that could come from really terrible sources that we do not want to fund. Versus the second stage are looking for products that might have chitin or might have other benefits like salicylic acid or these cool things we read about. So when we're buying an amendment, if it's already going to provide some nutrition, does it have anything else that it can add? And so we're looking for these secondary sources of enzymes, vitamins, hormones, just like when we're eating food. There's some foods that are superfoods and some just fill you up. If we have a choice, we choose to do both. A little bit of cost effectiveness with some superfoods. And the third stage is living material. A big part of the BuildASoil way is growing some cover crop, chopping and dropping fresh, living cells, not dead, dried cells, as part of an active participation. Maybe ferments do that. It's possible that there's living cells through that fermentation process, and maybe that's part of why it works so well. Maybe the compost tea is that living component. But I believe chopping and dropping fresh plant material, especially when you're a home gardener, you have no reason not to, can really fulfill that third living component. And incorporating all 3 types of these can systematically take advantage of all of nature's tricks now. Since I don't know how rhizophagy exactly works, I don't know exactly how this endocytosis works, but I do know without organic matter, without living cells that retransform, I won't be able to take advantage of it. So we build up these layers. Choosing soil amendments, slaughterhouse waste, lots of different things we talk about. I could go really on and on about just choosing it. That's really what BuildASoil does based on a lot of this conversation. Sprouted seed teas kind of steal the essence of life. Coots invented that tech and applied it to soil, and it's absolutely fascinating if you've not researched sprouted seeds, the enzymes they produce, and the essence of life that we can kind of biologically steal. Phenomenal. Indoor and outdoor. So I really wanted to get into bringing these methods indoor, but it's already been a couple of hours, and I really want to make sure that I just had enough content because there's so much we can talk about. But all of these practices are doable indoors, and the Living Soil community has found ways to do this, and we're here to help as a community. For commercial production, Steve Cantwell and early pioneers, we were very loosely part of the initial process here with Steve, and I think that's so amazing. In the beginning, we were just hoping someone would do a commercial production this way. We were like, I know it can be done. And when he first started, he had huge balls to be able to step up and invest money and do this. He worked with my buddy Matt Davenport in the beginning to take some of these ideas to scale. And he's still here doing multiple no-till rounds, following a lot of these principles. Of course, in a commercial production, you have to have SOPs. You can't do everything. No-till kings, they use cannabis stock mulch, huge beds. We have other grows like high ledges that are doing 30-gallon pots on the East Coast. So not everybody has to do it the same way. There's many adaptations is all I'm trying to, there's hundreds of people doing these things, but there's different styles. Anthony Brock, he was a buddy that he's now on the East Coast, but he was doing work in Western Colorado, and they had big 30-gallon containers, but they were fabric, and they were not doing as well when they did hard plastic and wrapping the sides before grassroots living soil pots were made. So they completely found out that when they had a hard plastic, even though they didn't like the container because they couldn't get a big enough one, their biology went through the roof, and they had better nutrient cycling, and they were able to keep up with their system. So when we found grassroots living soil pots, it took advantage of that high biological activity, similar to that Earthbox style, but now in many different sizes. Carver Family Farms, they're in New Mexico. They have a micro license with full vertical integration. They have rolling beds that they custom made, and they do all of their own process. They sell BuildASoil products. They make their own hash. Everything's fully integrated, and they're able to do these same exact things, whether it's big, small, big beds, small containers. All of these can be adapted. Stink Blossom, totally the opposite of all these. They use autopots, bottom watered in small containers using BuildASoil, and absolutely slay their numbers. I'm trying to get them to reuse the soil, but they just go, and they're getting off their old methodology. Commercial versions of the BuildASoil way adapt to more scalable processes, while some portion of the process may be removed, and the home grower can do them all. Like sometimes you don't want to top dress all this stuff, and you're worried about labor and all these functions of commercial versus the home grower. This is just a picture of our vegetable farm. We follow the same Connor Crickmore never sink system that deployed a lot of the systems here on this farm. They work really well. Connor Crickmore, never sink farms. Check out his systems. This is just some random pictures I tried to get to show you that this is a mulch layer here. Connor doesn't necessarily do that, but we were trying different practices to see how we could manage the feeding besides just soil testing. Outdoors, indoors, all of these processes have worked. Rootwise is one of our best-selling products, and I just love what he's doing, and I wanted to draw a few points before we come to conclusion here. Look at how beautiful this is. Now, here's something I put in here. It looks like a large version of GLP. Do you see what I'm seeing? Are you seeing the 1-gallon open bottom pots that Steve's using on his beds? Okay, what I want you to see here is that inside this greenhouse, Rootwise's greenhouse, where he's developing a lot of these theories, the base here that you see, that's 2 feet of luxury produced soil. That's not the native soil. That was all worked, of course, natively by I think there was chickens there before. I'd have to ask Kevin. So it was a chicken farm, like he had all his chickens there. Then he built the greenhouse. Then he built that layer of soil, cover cropped it, built the soil. He could have planted straight into it. Is that good of soil? Then instead, open bottom 400-gallon pots, just like Steve's 1-gallon's coming in. Boop, little baby version. This is the massive version because plant count. You can't grow a lot of plants when you're dealing with it back in the day. This is before a lot of the regulation we're under now. These are all custom open bottom pots that tap into the battery of the earth. All of the soil underneath was completely cover cropped first. These built on top, then cover crop ran. Then the entire garden was planted. Cover crop worked in. And you can see how it evolved. It's just unfucking believable what these systems can produce. I love it. The guys that grow the big trees, even though I don't really want to get it that big, like it's incredible. It's like world record pumpkin growers. Like we're all like, how do you do that? And so to get above 10 pounds on an outdoor plant, it's like legendary shit. And a lot of guys are trying to figure out in their climate, how do I do it? They're in Cali, I'm in Colorado. This is in Colorado in a shorter climate, pushing 10 to 20 pounds on a plant. And we're just following the basic principles. This is one of our best-selling products. I love biology. We could talk about it all day, but this was developed through a lot of these natural principles in conjunction. And then you can see something very similar copied indoors. The BuildASoil way was saying, well, if that worked, let's grow the cover crop. Let's break it back down. Boom, no soil test. Looks pretty healthy to me. Of course, we got better. We started doing soil testing because we're producing products to put out for other people. Last year, this guy Travis just won. The year before, it was North American record, but this last year, he won the entire world record utilizing the Rootwise biological program. I'm not trying to say that, hey, he couldn't have done it. There's no other way, but did you see that he's using biology to produce world fucking records? When I first started BuildASoil, this book really got me excited because this guy's producing these world record results, making homemade compost, using cover crop 10 feet behind his crop, using mulch, and dripping. Accurate water, mulching, cover crop, compost, world record. I'm like, fuck, this works? Like that? If you go to educational at BuildASoil.com, we have our environmental guide, our watering protocol. We're trying to give free information away, and that's just where some of this will be housed as we develop more under the educational tab, and that's always going to be free. Our YouTube is another resource you can check out. We have, looks like 178,000 people now that are following, and it's really the reason why BuildASoil is in business. I can't believe the power of the internet. So if you're looking to start your company and do your thing, I'm not that special. I just record content every fucking week about what I'm passionate about. I'd encourage you to do the same. If you like that stuff, check out our YouTube video. It could change your life. And at the very end here, these are just 21 principles you're going to hear more about from BuildASoil as we go over them. These are a lot of the things we've adapted towards indoor, and there's whole conversations behind these pieces. But that'll be for another soil event when I have more time to talk. This is really what I'd like to get into over the next year or so. We're developing a lot more clear-cut educational downloads for our customers to answer every one of these questions for how their style is going to be. Right now at BuildASoil, our feeding schedule is all over the place because it was people asking us how to use every product. We're going to slow that down and put it into its proper place. How to water based on your system, whether it's automated or hand. How to choose your feeding process, small containers. Are you doing water only? We'll have an exact system for that. And to bring it all back around, the reamendment process. But that'll be for another day. Today, I'd like to just end this with saying thank you so much for coming here to listen to all these phenomenal speakers. Coming together as a community, you can see the very first principle is community. BuildASoil wouldn't be here without all of you guys growing and learning and sharing this information with us. And beyond that, are there any questions that I can answer before we wrap up for the night? I think we're all like, no, 2 hours of that. I don't fucking have any questions.
Any questions, anybody?
Anybody have any questions? Okay, let's do it. Let's take a couple.
It's not really a question, more just a thank you. I live all the way in the southeast, and BuildASoil and Coots Mix is kind of what got me started in organics, and then got me moved back to my family's farm. And my dad kind of went to organics and regenerative farming now. So it was one of those.
So you're
pretty
saying
early
that
steps.
your hobby turned into something that's changing your farm,
Yes.
actually. Yeah.
Yes.
Fuck yeah, that's what I want to hear.
And
Thank you.
and Chris Trump and all that stuff.
Awesome. Thank you.
So thanks.
Just want to say thanks as well,
Yeah.
man. Sorry, I got here a little bit late, got caught
Oh,
up
dude,
out
don't
there.
worry about it.
I wish I could have heard more of the history lesson, dude, because the little bit I caught was epic, dude. And just super thankful. Before you, man, it was so hard to find ingredients. I had to settle for way less than what you made available. And when you made it available, it was just my first personal mix I mixed by myself, and I've posted pictures of it, was all with ingredients, and obviously some locally sourced stuff too, but the
Yeah.
stuff I couldn't find, you provided, you made it possible to mix soil, to make, like you said, it was hard to find stuff back then, guys. Like, and he saw a void and was like, dude, if it's hard for me, it's hard for everybody. I can fill
Yeah.
that void, and that's why you're successful. So
Oh, yeah.
thank you, bro. You're a warrior. You're fighting the good fight, dude. I always
yeah.
have your back. I'm forever thankful.
Thank you so much. That means a lot.
Yeah, the early part had me thinking of the early microbial or bacteria communities fusing together. If facultative bacteria are potentially just two different bacteria together, and that's how, let's say, like a Rhodopseudomonas platurus can be phototropic and chemotropic, and also maybe there could be other organisms in play to be able to go anaerobic or aerobic in those environments.
Yeah, and so what you're thinking now is, instead of one organism that's phase switching, are these teamed up members that had unique jobs in their past life that have now said, well, fuck it, my other half knows how to do that, we'll switch. I think so. There's got to be more to this transformation ability within microbials, because one of the things that you'll hear in the Rhizophagy when he's talking about it, he's like, well, who cares what microbes are in there? There are no special microbes. They all do the job. So he's thinking if it's there, it's doing what it's supposed to do. Who cares what it's called? But you can tell he doesn't truly feel that. It's just that he's coming to an understanding that there isn't one magic microbe. Maybe these teams, maybe these consortiums, maybe the building blocks and how they work is much more important. And I'm like, well, shit, if we evolved, if microbes evolved, that makes sense to me, you know? Yeah, absolutely. Hell yeah. Cool.
Thank you, Jesse. All
Well,
right, guys. Anything else?
I appreciate you guys being here. What's up?
Oh.
I mean, I think everybody understands and recognizes what your company provides. What has been the biggest challenge to provide these sources that are clean, that are acceptable,
That's a really good question. So challenge has been working with smaller producers to have consistent availability, to deal with logistics, to deal with weather. The other thing that's been the hardest is becoming the person that it takes to run the business. So across all of it, you have challenges. Across just learning about soil in itself is a challenge. When you're running a business, whether it's a farm for production, whether it's distribution or sales, like it challenges you across the board. So that's probably been the biggest thing. With suppliers, man, you'll find something and you're like, this is perfect. And for instance, Malibu, I love them. They're a good compost. Maybe you can make better in your backyard, who knows? But when it comes to scale, they go to a specific dairy. The cattle are like acupuncture. We found an acupuncture needle. We had to call and figure it out. They were like massaging. It's crazy how far they go for that dairy. And I like it. But at the end of the day, I got a batch from California that was completely different because that's a different farm. Well, I caught it and tested it and knew, but it's like, fuck, you can't change stuff once I like it. And organics doesn't work that way. It's never exactly the same. So that's been a big deal. And then the other thing has been having redundancies and building an anti-fragile model. A lot of times you'll build a business and when you're ignorant or when you're naive because you're new, you're thinking it'll just always be the same way. But man, I got to tell you, I spent an extra way too much money parking peat moss when Corona hit and they were shutting the Canadian border. Like you just start to freak out. You're like, okay, I'm going to need 6 months worth and what's going to happen here? And that compost producer had a problem. What do I do here? And there's a lot behind the scenes that goes on. Heavy metals, when that first broke loose, and all of the different challenges that every different state had different regulations, testing every single input, all of those things became challenging. So just like farming, there's challenges running a business, but I wouldn't say that I don't like it. In fact, that's one of the funnest parts is that I know that the person that I've become can deal with those challenges. And that's why when I talk about jiu-jitsu and I got all excited because I look up to him, he's a UFC legend, all the stuff that goes behind, that gives me insight without knowing him into the person he is to have gone through that. And so behind the scenes with BuildASoil, just like you with your farm, these fucking farms and this growing thing teaches us lessons. And so that's been one of the most impactful things. So thank you. Good question.
All right, guys, I guess,
How have you gone about, checking the products you mentioned things that weren't even on the label and the Coot taught you how, and how do you go about finding those things that aren't on the label or find out what this company's doing or what they're, reading between
So
the
a
lines?
lot of times if you find that it's not on the label, you just don't use it. You find out that they're just not going to give you their secret sauce. And a lot of times in the fertilizer game, it's just some cheap components and they say, sorry, it's proprietary. So just don't use that. I do not eat food like that. If it says secret formulation, I am 100% out. And then when you're looking at ingredients, what we do as far as testing is we investigate first without wasting money if they have any testing. A lot of times they don't. If they do, I read it. If it looks good, that's great. Then I'll get a sample. Then we send it to multiple labs, heavy metal testing, nutrient profile testing. And so all of that can take time, which means that to investigate new products, you have to have the energy to do so. And you have to have resources set aside because you don't want to stop looking for new things. But it's fairly basic. I just think in the beginning it can catch you. If you have 50 different products, and you're not sure which one's causing a problem, it gets really scary. What we found through heavy metals that mined minerals were more likely to fluctuate. All the organics weren't really the culprit. Like organic minerals, like calcium phosphate is one of the worst ones for cadmium. Out of Florida, 1% cadmium. Out of, let's say, Nevada, maybe 300 parts per million cadmium or something. So certain things we learned from, but really the investigation's pretty simple. It's just that there's no real reason for the industry to do it, so none of the information was available, which means it's pay to play. You got to do all your own research. So most of these grows realized that, and they started doing all of their own testing on all of their own inputs, just like we have to do. And so the hope is publishing all of that puts a little more trust, and then not everybody has to waste that much money just to look. So, yep. Cool. Well, thank you so much. I know there's probably more questions. I really do want to wrap it up. It's getting late for everyone, and there's some people that really want to go, and this is fucking incredible. Thank you so much. Sorry for cussing so much, but this is awesome. I love you guys. Thank you so much.
thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. There you go. All right, guys, so there's food ready out there for you if you guys are hungry. I hope you guys grab some grub. Thank you. Appreciate you guys. Maybe we can take a picture real quick here. Yeah.